The Milagro Beanfield War by John Nichols, read by Cheech Marin. This Newman book on cassette is produced by Newman Communications Corporation.
Many people in the Miracle Valley had theories about why Joe Mondragon did it. At first, the somewhat addle-brained but sympathetic sheriff, Bernabe Montoya, figured he was just a kid, now almost middle-aged, with a king-size chip on his shoulder going slightly amok. The frontier bar owner, Tranquilino Giantete, said, with a sardonic wink, that Joe did it because he was hungry for an enchilada made from honest-to-God Milagro frijoles, with some divine company cojones mixed in. Nick Real, the storekeeper, figured Joe might have done it because he could not pay the $90-odd he owed the store, or else maybe he did it just out of sheer renegade inbred spite. The chief perpetrator of the Indian Creek Dam, Lad Divine III, who held Milagro's fate in his hand like a fragile egg, considered what Joe did a personal assault on his empire, on the Indian Creek Dam, and on that egg. And the immortal old man, Amarante Cordova, who lived on the west side of the highway in the ghost town neighborhood, believed Joe did it because God had ordered him to start the revolution without any further delay. Amarante Cordova had 13 children. That is, he and his wife Elizabeth, known as Betita, had 13 children. Betita, who had never been sick a day in her life, died in 1963 on November 22nd, on the same day as President Kennedy. The Cordova sons and daughters had scattered, as the saying goes, to the four winds, or actually only to the three winds, eastward being anathema to the children of Milagro. All his life, Amarante had lived in the shadow of his own death. He had rheumatic fever, chicken pox, pneumonia 3 or 4 times, started coughing blood when he was 6 and was anemic, drowsy all the time, constantly sniffling, weak and miserable, and everybody thought, dying. During the old man's 40s, the number of contending diseases dropped by Amarante's body for a shot at the title. The clap came and went, had a return bout, and was counted out. The measles appeared as did the mumps. They did not even last a full round. Amarante limped, coughed, wheezed, his chest ached, his flat feet wailed, arthritis took sledgehammers to his knees, his stomach felt like it was bleeding, and all but 3 of his teeth turned brown and toppled out of his mouth like acorns. In Milagro, waiting for Amarante Cordova to drop dead was like waiting for one of those huge sneezes that just refuses to come. Amarante Cordova had played 7-card stud poker with death ever since 1880, winning every hand. Joe Mondragon was 36 years old, and for a long time he held no steady job. He had a wife, Nancy, and 3 children, and his own house, which he had built with his own hands, a small, tight adobe that required mudding every 2 or 3 autumns. Joe was always hard up, always hustling to make a buck. Over the years, he had learned how to do almost any job. He knew everything about building houses. He knew how to mix mud and straw just right to make strong adobe that would not crumble. Though unlicensed, he could steal and lay his own plumbing, do all the electric fixtures in the house, and hire 5 peons at slave wages to install a septic tank that would not overflow until the day after Joe died or left town. Given half the necessary equipment, he could dig a well, and he understood everything there was to understand about pumps. He could tear down a useless tractor and piece it together again so niftily it would plow like balls of fire for at least a week before blowing up and maiming his driver. He could disc and seed a field and irrigate it properly. Hell, Joe liked to brag. I can grow sweet corn by just using my own spit and a little ant piss. Joe had worked his own workshop crammed full of tools he had begged, borrowed, stolen, or bought from various friends, enemies, and employers down through the years. Just to survive, there had to be almost nothing Joe couldn't or would not at least try to do. But he was tired. Joe had to admit that. He was tired like most of his neighbors were tired, from trying to earn a living off the land in the country where the government systematically gathered up the souls of little ranchers and used them to light its cigars. He was tired of meeting each spring with the prospect of having to become a migrant and head north to the lettuce and potato fields in Colorado, where a man groveled under the blazing sun 10 hours a day for $1 fucking an hour. He was tired, too, of each year somehow losing a few cows off the permits he had to graze them on the government's national forest land. And he was tired of the way the permit fees were always being hiked, driving himself and his kind not only batty, but also out of business. And he was damn fed up with having to buy a license to hunt deer on land that had belonged to Grandfather Mondragon and his cronies, but which now resided in the hip pockets of either Smokey the Bear, the state, or the local malevolent despot, Lad Divine III. Joe was tired of the fighting. In the end, he had just had his ass kicked and nothing ever changed. In fact, Milagro itself was half a ghost town, and all the old west side bean fields were barren because over 35 years ago, during some complicated legal and political maneuverings known as the 1935 Interstate Water Compact, Much of Milagro's water had been reallocated to big-time farmers down in the southeast portion of the state or in Texas. This situation had caused a deep, long, smoldering, and fairly universal resentment, but nobody, least of all Joe Mondragon, had ever been able to figure out how to bring water back to that deserted west side land, most of which by now belonged to Lad Devine III and his motley assortment of dyspeptic vultures, who, not surprisingly, now that they had owned it, had figured out a way to make the west side green again. But then one day Joe suddenly decided to irrigate the little field in front of his dead parents' decaying west side home, which Joe still owned, in itself a miracle, and grow himself some beans. It was that simple. And yet irrigating that field was an act as irrevocable as Hitler's invasion of Poland or the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, because it was certain to catalyze tensions which had been building for years, certain to precipitate a war. And like any war, this one also had roots that traveled deeply into the past. For several hundred years, and until quite recently, Milagro had been a sheep town. Nearly all the fathers of Joe Mondragon's generation had been sheepmen. There was no man, however, and there had been no men for more than 100 years perhaps who had truly made a living off sheep, because Milagro was a company town, and almost every herder, simply in order to survive as a sheepman, had been connected to the Lad Devine Sheep Company. And being a sheepman connected to the Devine Company was like trying to raise mutton in a tank full of sharks. For this, the people of the Miracle Valley had the U.S. government to thank, because shortly after the war between the U.S. and Mexico, the U.S. Congress effectively outlawed communal property, passing vast acreages into the public domain, tracts which then suddenly wound up in the hands of large American ranching enterprises like the Devine Company. Later, during Teddy Roosevelt's era, much remaining communal territory was designated national forest, in which a rancher could only run his animals providing he had the money and political pull to obtain grazing permits. Hence, soon after the 1848 war, most local ranchers found themselves up to their elbows in sheep with no place to graze them. In Milagro, this meant that most sheep ranchers had become serfs of the Devine Company, which managed to own outright or secure the grazing rights to all the property on the Jorge Sandoval land grant in Chamisa County. At the end of each year since this takeover, every sheepman, woman, and child in Milagro had discovered themselves heavily in debt to the Devine Company. Of course, the Lad Devine Company had not only been interested in land and sheep in its company store, now Nick Real store. The Dancing Trout Dude Ranch and Health Spa had been operating on the Devine estate up in Milagro Canyon ever since the early 20s. When the Pilar Cafe was constructed across from the company store in 1949, it was a Devine operation. And when more recently the Enchanted Land Motel was built on the north-south highway to handle the new breed of pudgy tourists, it was a Devine financed and Devine-controlled operation. To be truthful, the Devine Company, which had gotten fat on sheep, was not dealing in wool anymore. The company had much more interest in a project called the Indian Creek Dam, a structure to be located in Milagro Canyon that was considered the essential cornerstone of a Devine development endeavor known as the Miracle Valley Recreation Area. And now, que milagro, the Indian Creek Dam was conveniently going to restore water rights to the west side so Lad Devine III could bless the few surviving small farmers of Milagro with a ritzy subdivision molded around an exotic and very green golf course. And the dam, or paying for it, that is, would be made possible by creating a conservancy district whose boundaries for taxation purposes would incorporate almost all the town's largely destitute citizens, wherein lay a rather profound rub. At least one person understood this rub. The old bartender at the frontier, Tranquilino Giantete, began telling anybody who would listen. "You watch. The conservancy district and the dam is a dirty trick. It's one more way to steal our houses and our land, and we'll be paying the taxes for Lad Devine's lake, and when we can't pay our conservancy assessments, they'll take our land and give it to Devine. And that fucking Zopilote will sit there on his throne in his fucking castle putting pennies on our eyes as they carry us to the Camposanto one by one." But most farmers, completely baffled by the complexity of a conservancy district, did not know what to do. Should they hire a lawyer and fight the vulture? Or should they just sit tight and trust that, like Amarante Cordova, they could somehow miraculously survive? In the end, after much talk and many heated arguments, the people philosophized. That conservancy district and that dam will be as hard to live with as Pacheco's pig. Pacheco being an enormous, shifty-eyed, hysterically lonely man who had been losing his marbles ever since his wife died 6 years ago, and who owned one of the world's most ornery sows, an animal he could never keep penned. Pacheco was forever knocking on front doors and back doors and outhouse doors asking after a sow, and people were forever shouting at and shooting at and throwing rocks at Pacheco's gargantuan voracious animal. Yet for a long time the pig had led a charmed life, and because the pig, with Pacheco limping crazily after it, had become such a familiar sight all over town, sayings had grown out of the situation, such as, "He's more trouble than Pacheco's pig," or "She's got an appetite like Pacheco's pig," and again, "It's indestructible as Pacheco's pig," and of course, "That conservancy district and that dam will be as hard to live with as Pacheco's pig." Which is where things stood when Joe Mondragon suddenly tugged on his irrigation boots, flung a shovel into his pickup, and drove over to his parents' crumbling farmhouse and small dead front field in the west side ghost town. Joe spent about an hour chopping weeds in the long unused Royball ditch, and then, after digging a small feeder trench from Indian Creek into the ditch, he opened the Royball ditch head gate at the other end so that water could flow into that fallow land. After that, Joe stood on the ditch bank smoking a cigarette. It was a soft and misty early spring morning. Trees had only just begun to leaf out. Fields across the highway were still brown, and snow lay hip-deep in the midnight mountains. Milagro itself was almost hidden in the bluish pinon smoke coming from all the fireplaces and cook stoves of its old adobe houses. And the water just kept gurgling into that field, sending ants scurrying for their lives, while Joe puffed a cigarette on this particularly quiet lavender morning. About 15.5 minutes after Joe Mondragon first diverted water from Indian Creek into his parents' old bean field, most of Milagro knew what he had done. On this particular day, as soon as 93-year-old Amarante Cordova had safely landed his crippled frame on a stool in the huge empty Frontier bar and fixed a baleful, bloodshot eye on the owner, 88-year-old Tranquilino Giantete, he said in Spanish, because he did not speak English or read or write in either language, "Jose Mondragon is irrigating his old man's bean field over there on the west side." Tranquilino turning up his hearing aid, muttering, "Eh?" Ambrosio Romero, a burly carpenter who worked at the Doña Luz mine, sauntered through the doors for his morning constitutional, just as Amarante repeated, "Jose Mondragon is irrigating his old man's bean field over there on the west side." Ambrosio went directly from the bar to Real's store, where he bought some Hostess Twinkies for a mid-morning snack at the mine, and also casually mentioned to Nick Real, "I hear Joe Mondragon is irrigating over on the west side of the highway." 4 men and 2 women in Real's store heard this exchange. These 6 people scattered like quail hit by buckshot, and by noon, everyone knew that feisty little Joe Mondragon had gone and diverted the water illegally into his parents' no-account bean field. At 2 that afternoon, an informal meeting convened in Real's general store, called by the sheriff, 43-year-old Bernabe Montoya, who sensed a serious threat in Joe's bean field, because that fucking bean field was an instant and potentially explosive symbol. And the only surprise about the whole affair, as Bernabe saw it, was how come nobody thought of it sooner? "So, I don't really know what to do," he told the gathering. "That's how come I called this meeting. If I go over and tell him to stop, he'll tell me to shove a chile or something you know where. And if I go over to arrest him, he'll try to kick me in the balls. And anyway, I don't know what the water law is. I don't even know what to arrest him for, or charge him with, or how long I could hold him. It seems to me it's more up to the water users or to the ditch commissioner, and the ditch boss is here to stop him." The 2 ditch commissioners and the mayordomo shrugged, remaining self-consciously silent. Eusebio Lavarie, the town's only rich Chicano rancher, suddenly exploded. "For Christ's sake, what a bunch of gutless wonders we have in this room. If you're all too chicken to do it, I'll go talk to that little bastard myself. There's no room in a town like ours for this kind of outrageous lawlessness." 5 minutes later, Lavarier's 4-wheel drive pickup lurched into Joe Mondragon's yard, scattering chickens and a few flea-bitten hounds. A cigarette lodged toughly between his lips, Joe emerged from his shop, tinkering busily with a crowbar. "Howdy, cousin," Lavarier said. Joe nodded, eyes crinkled against the cigarette smoke. Nancy opened the front door and stood there, flanked by 2 big-eyed kids. "I came over to talk to you about that field you're irrigating on the other side of the highway," Lavarier said. "Oh, yeah? What interest you got in that bean field?" Joe asked. "Well, I figure it's bad for this town. Whatever stirs up unnecessary trouble is bad for all of us, que no?" Joe shrugged, inhaled, exhaled, and replaced the cigarette bogey-like between his lips. "Well, I just came from a meeting we held over in Nick's store," Lavarier said. "We decided that since it's illegal to irrigate those west side fields, we ought to tell you to quit fucking around over there." Joe delicately flicked the head off a small sunflower with a crowbar. "You know what? Maybe you better quit fucking around over here." Lavarier flushed but kept his cool. Are you or are you not going to stop irrigating that field? Joe smiled blandly. The real question is, are you or are you not going to get off my property, Mr. Lavadier? He advanced a few steps, flexing the crowbar. Lavadier hastily backed up into his truck. Well, what are you doing? Are you threatening me? This is my property, Joe said, matter of fact. Well, God damn you. Lavadier slid behind the wheel of his truck and started up. I'll go over there myself and see that not another drop goes into that field. Oh, yeah? Well, you do, and won't nobody show up for work at your place tomorrow, Mr. Lavadier. And your hay and your corrals might get burned by accident, too. Lavadier fumed silently for a full 10 seconds before jamming the gear shift into reverse and bouncing backward out of the yard. And? Bernabe Montoya politely inquired several minutes later. Lavadier, pacing around the sheriff's living room, shook his head nervously. What do you think, Bernie? Could he really get people to stop working at my place? Would he have the guts to burn my hay? Sure, maybe. Who knows? I'd be up the creek without a paddle if that happened. This is more complicated than I thought. That little shithead's got no respect, does he? Nope. Following an awkward pause, Lavadier said, I think maybe I'll better back out of this, Bernie. I think maybe the best thing right now is I shouldn't get involved, que no? Suit yourself, Mr. Lavadier. It's just I didn't realize, I had no idea. After Lavadier had slunk off, Bernabe slouched out to his pickup and steered onto the highway, turning south. It made him uncomfortable to confront this thing. He had no idea how to deal with it. So, he decided to try and pass the buck. He drove to the tiny cinder block state police headquarters at Doña Luz. Bernabe smiled tiredly at Kuntz, the state cop. I came down here because I got a problem. Kuntz smiled. So what else is new? Well, there's a guy up in my town, maybe you know him, Joe Mondragon. He's irrigating his old man's bean field on the western side of the highway. Sounds to me like the ditch boss, the one you people call the major domo, ought to handle this kind of thing, Kuntz said. What could we do about it? Well, maybe you don't understand. Bernabe scratched behind one ear. It's not like he's just irrigating his little bean field. That field is symbolic. People are bitter over how they lost their land and their water rights. And this sort of act, small as it may seem, could touch off something bigger. What do you want us to do? I don't know. Frankly, I don't know what to do about it. It's not like you just go over and arrest him or fuck up the bean field or something. I mean, this is too close to everybody. Kuntz frowned. I'm not sure I understand, Bernie. Why don't you get in touch with Trucho down in the Capitol? This is his sector, isn't it? Javier Trucho, the third highest-ranking cop in the state in charge of the entire northern sector, said, Repeat the whole thing to me again, Bill, slowly. It ain't much. Kuntz was suddenly nervous about the bean field. There's just this little guy, Joe Mondragon, who's cutting water into some deserted field. He isn't supposed to have water rights on the west side of the highway, in that ghost town part of Milagro, that's all. I think what I'll do is talk with the state engineer. Seems to me his office ought to handle it. I'll get back to you. And when he got back, Trucho said, Listen, Bill, this thing could be a little antsy. For the time being, we're going to steer clear of it. The state engineer's office will handle it, or at least try to. The key word here is tact. All right? Okay. Bill Kuntz was suddenly puzzled by the respect people seemed to be developing for Joe Mondragon and his puny bean field. 5 men were seated around a large oval table in the conference room off the governor's office in the state capitol. There was the governor himself, a tall, heavily built man with small, nervous eyes that never really looked at anybody, and a cowboy twang when he spoke. A successful rancher who had some successful oil interests and close but largely disguised ties to several big-time land developers who were moving into the state. The other men with the governor in the room were the state engineer, Nelson Bookman, a lawyer from the state engineer's office named Rudy Noyes, a short, swarthy aide to the governor, his bodyguard actually, and Kirill Montana, an undercover agent for the state police. Bookman and Noyes had more political power than the governor. The governor was a landman. He understood a lot about how to speculate for land, graze it, subdivide it, make it pay dividends. But still, the land in the desert state was worth nothing without water, and Bookman and Noyes controlled the water. In their back pockets, they had the arteries of the state, the rivers, the streams, the creeks, and the ponds, and the reservoirs that created its valleys of life. However they planned their water, that is how and in what direction the state would grow. And now these men were gathered in the conference room of the governor's office for a very specific reason, and that reason was Joe Mondragon. All right, said the governor.
Here's a half-pint son of a bitch cut water he has no right to into a half-pint field and that'll never grow a decent bean, and what the hell are we going to do about it? Bookman, the state engineer, lighting his cigarette, slightly rearranged a single sheet of 8 by 11 typing paper that lay in front of him. He threatened to kick my man's butt out of there, and he said if any more feds came around this place bothering him when he was at work, he'd dust their asses with buckshots because they were trespassing on his private property. We've gone back to Milagro twice since then. After he irrigated the first time, Mondragon plowed the field and then disced it and planted it with beans, with irrigation trenches running beside each row. The third time we went up, the earth in the field was wet and green and grass was growing around the edges and more sparsely down along the ditches. Obviously, the field was receiving water regularly, so we almost served him with papers giving him 30 days to prove he has water rights to that piece of land. If he couldn't prove it, the state could order him to stop irrigation, and there'd be a hearing. And that could get sticky because there'd be a lot of attendant publicity, maybe hostility, which could hurt the Conservancy District and the dam and the whole Miracle Valley setup with Lad Devine. It's a tricky business to try and implant a tourist development in the middle of a hornet's nest. What makes you feel there'd be so much publicity? Carol Montana asked. Well, for one thing, there's a lawyer, Bookman said. He happens to be Joe Mondragon's lawyer, and he also sometimes writes articles for a small monthly paper published in the capital here, The Voice of the People. He's a strange fella, a displacement from the East Coast. He worked for Colorado for a while, in Alamosa, in the legal aid program up there. Then he moved to Milagro. In a quiet way, he defends the poor. He's not a raving liberal, though he has done cases for chickens, tomatoes, and cucumbers, but never, as far as I know, for land. So he's acquired a certain trust up there. What's his name? Carol Montana asked. Charlie Bloom. He wrote a story not implicating anybody, but in a general way running down Lad Devine's relationship to the town, the Conservancy District, and the dam and so forth, and the poverty of the Miracle Valley and all that. He treats it like nobody knows who's irrigating the field. He makes it out like the entire town is irrigating the plot. It's a propaganda article, a socialist tract in a way, I suppose, but it might be effective. Nobody, or at least hardly nobody, reads The Voice, but you can never tell. You don't want this to blow up into something symbolic. Now, that's your department more than mine. You know these people. You have the information. Carol Montana nodded again and jotted down a few more notes on his pad. Bookman waited until he was through writing before resuming. Like I said, we don't want this thing to blow up into something symbolic. Now, I've talked with Lad Devine, and of course he knows there's a deep-rooted resentment in that town, and that the Miracle Valley Project is going to have to tiptoe into Milagro like a drunk husband with his shoes off. Maybe it doesn't seem so now, but that's potentially one hell of a volatile area up there in the north. Carol Montana said, What are Mondragon's chances of proving he has water rights to that field? 0. He has no rights. I suppose at a hearing your special water master was to find that Joe Mondragon did have some water rights to that field. Wouldn't that help you out of the situation? Well, the rest of the fields Devine doesn't own yet, including 4 or 5 acres he needs for that golf course but hasn't gotten yet, would immediately come under irrigation, making it that much harder to consolidate the entire area. The problem is, said the governor, that this man has got to be discouraged before we ever get to the hearing stage. So scare him. I don't think he's going to scare that easily. At length, the agent said, Do you think if he lost the hearing, he would quit? Bookman said, I know he wouldn't. Sooner or later, we'll have to arrest him. We simply don't want this hearing, and we don't want to arrest Joe Mondragon for using water they lost in 1935 to grow beans today. The worst thing we could do is make him a martyr. The governor said, What do you think, Kai? Carol Montana put his notebook away and stubbed out his cigarette. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll go up there, study the town, talk a little, chat. I think we already have a file on Bloom. If memory serves me, there's a couple of decent-sized holes in his life. So although right now I can't say for sure, perhaps we'll start with a lawyer. They all got to their feet then and returned to their separate offices. There were no windows in Amarante Cordova's remaining one room. Long ago he had adobe them up solid to preserve heat. All the same, he woke up on this morning, as he did every morning at first daylight, and slowly commenced his day, climbing out from under about 25 pounds of crazy quilts and old army blankets, and hastily drawing on his sloppy old suit over his patched, foul-smelling long underwear. Then he took a shot from a half-pint brandy bottle, and before rolling a cigarette, hefted a couple of pinon logs from the corner stack and stuffed them into his $12 Sears tin heater. And on this morning, after he put on his thick-lensed eyeglasses, Amarante also observed Joe Mondragon several fields away, irrigating his bean plants. The old man watched Joe work with interest, with a certain feeling of pride, even with a kind of reverence. Amarante had been born on Milagro's west side in the same house when it was intact, and he had worked the fields that now lay fallow about him. And someday he would die on the west side, in his room, or from a heart attack while splitting wood, or maybe he would freeze to death in the ditch some sparkling winter night on his way back from the frontier bar. But whatever, Amarante had stuck with the west side, saying goodbye to his neighbors one by one while refusing to budge himself, until he had wound up alone with the swallows and the bluebirds and the crumbling houses whose rooms were full of tumbleweeds. Then here suddenly was a stubborn, ornery little bastard who had decided to put some life back into the west side. And as Joe Mondragon's bean plant started to grow, Amarante fixed his eyes on that patch of green, feeling excited and warm and a lot less lonely, too. It hadn't taken long, though, for Amarante to realize that Joe's bean sprouts were really going to stir up something in Milagro. And so on this morning, Amarante had a special plan. He drank only 1 cup of coffee, hastily gummed down 2 Piggly Wiggly tortillas wrapped around some tiny Vienna sausages, made sure a full book of food stamps was stashed safely inside his inside breast pocket, and then from a peg driven into the mud wall over his bed, he removed a cracked leather gun belt and holster, which he buckled around his skinny waist. From a painted tin box, Amarante then removed a well-oiled revolver, an old, very heavy Colt Peacemaker. His father had given him the gun 80 years ago. In fact, the gun had rarely been used even for target practice, but it had always been his most cherished possession. He stopped near Joe's bean field. He waved at Joe, who was leaning against his shovel, and Joe called, "Howdy, Chief. What's with a pistol this morning?" Amarante cackled, "I'll take care of you. I'll take care of this field." "Sure, you do that for me, Chief." Gently, Joe smiled. "You and me together, friend. We'll keep those bastards at bay, que no?" In town a few minutes later, instead of heading as usual for the bar, he hoofed it directly over to Real's general store and, pulling the gun from its holster, laid the weapon atop the rubber change mat on the counter in front of Nick Real. "What kind of bullets does this take?" Amarante asked. "I forgot. I want to buy some shells." "Sure." Nick swung out from behind the counter, ambling across the store to his ammo shelves, and selected a box of 45 shells, which he slapped in Amarante's hands. The old man asked, "How much?" $3.29 plus 14 pennies for the governor equals $3.43 altogether. "What are you going to do, Pop? Go hunting for bear?" Grinning, Amarante produced the food stamp books and painstakingly tore out 4 $1 stamps, which he laid carefully on the counter. Nick pushed them back, shaking his head. "Hey, Grandpa, you can't buy bullets with food stamps. They're only good for food. You got to pay me money." The old man laid the food stamps on the counter again. "This is the same as money." Smiling, Amarante picked up the shells and dropped the box in his pocket. "Hey, wait, not food stamps. Money. I need money for these shells." Amarante nodded towards the food stamps on the counter, hoisted his gun, and jammed it carefully into the holster, touched the front brim of his rumpled hat by way of saying good day, and lurched off. Cursing, Nick snatched up the food stamps and slapped them into the space under the black plastic cash pan in the till. Amarante teetered into the frontier bar, saluted his comrade Tranquilino Giantete, tugged himself onto a stool, placed the pistol in the box of shells on the bar, and while Tranquilino watched, he slowly and very carefully loaded the gun. "What do you want to load the gun for?" the bartender asked. "Life isn't hard enough. You're out looking for more trouble?" "Sometimes it's necessary to carry a gun." "And what could you hit? A dead elephant from 2 feet away?" "Sometimes a man should carry a gun." "Well, who do you think you are, Pancho Villa, the Lone Ranger?" Amarante looked stonily straight ahead. His wrinkled old hand lay firmly atop the gun. After a long silence, Tranquilino fetched 2 glasses, filling both a third full of cheap bourbon. Placing one glass next to Amarante's gun hand, he said, "Let's both have a drink to your stupid gun." Amarante cracked no smile, but he did move his hand from the gun to the glass, and the 2 old-timers drank. About half an hour later, as his friend left the bar, Tranquilino called, "Hey, Pancho Villa, you forgot your cannon." Amarante returned, almost daintily lifted the weapon off the bar and stuck it in the holster, and then suddenly they both started to laugh. Out in the sunshine, Amarante swayed and blinked. A pickup carrying plumbing slowed down and stopped, and the woman from the Strawberry Mesa Body Shop and Pipe Queen, Ruby Archuleta, poked her red bandanaed head out of the window. Hey, Amarante, what are you going to do with that gun? He grinned, tipping his hat to her. She pointed. How come the hardware, cousin? Who are you going to plug? A Thanksgiving turkey. A big Thanksgiving turkey. Ruby arched her eyebrows, laughing. But make sure it's pointed in the right direction before you squeeze the trigger. She bolted her truck away. Whereupon Amarante Cordova, shining in triumphal light, bumped into Serafino Pacheco, who had tears in his eyes. My pig is gone again, Pacheco moaned. Fie on your pig! Death to your voracious pig, the old man spat. She was in her pen this morning, Pacheco called, but Amarante couldn't have cared less. He was heading home. Amarante surveyed the damp earth, the glistening green bean plants, the faint yellow irrigation foam left around the stalks, the mud cracking softly in some freshly watered rows, and sat down on the log at the edge of Joe Mondragon's bean field. He reloaded the gun, placing it on the log beside him. Next, he rolled a cigarette, and quietly smoking, he listened woozily to a faint meadowlark's songs drifting melodically on the clear summer air. From here on in, he thought, if anybody like Eusebio Lavadier or Zope Divine tried to mess with Joe Mondragon's bean field, they would have to reckon with Amarante Cordova first. For years, many stories about the Strawberry Mesa Body Shop and Pipe Queen tycoon Ruby Archuleta had circulated between Milagro and Doña Luz. Some folks swore she was a witch. A few misguided harpies insinuated she had poisoned the 3 husbands who had died on her. In fact, Ruby Archuleta was an uncertified midwife who had been safely delivering babies since 1940. She was also qualified as one of the best fishermen in the area and was also a deer hunter supreme. And whenever raspberries ripened in the local canyons, 1,000 jars of Ruby's raspberry jam appeared almost instantly on the shelves of Real's store in Milagro, and she raked in the dinero hand over fist. This dynamo measured 5 feet 2 inches tall, was 49 years old, and her misty red hair had turned mostly to gray. With her son Eliu, her gigantic lover Claudio Garcia, and a roly-poly hillbilly mechanic named Marvin LeBleu, she lived in a mud-plastered railroad tie house situated on a hill overlooking the Body Shop and Pipe Queen, an enterprise inherited from her first husband. Awake each morning at 5, Ruby dressed in a work shirt, weathered jeans, and cowboy boots, cooked breakfast for the men, tied her long hair up in a red checkered bandana, and marched outside to start overhauling cars or organizing plumbing jobs. She cut pipe, welded pipe joints, installed shocks, and stripped down hinges, you name it. Whatever Claudio Garcia, Marvin LeBleu, or his son could do, Ruby could do better. Hence, though a small-time operation, like everything else Ruby tackled, the Body Shop and Pipe Queen was the best operation of its kind in the country. Shortly after Joe cut water illegally into his field, Ruby Archuleta, her son Eliu, Claudio Garcia, and Marvin LeBleu stopped to cast a first appraising and appreciative glance at Joe's field. Even after the men grew bored and returned to listen to the truck's radio, Ruby stayed by the field thinking about that damp earth, those fragile bean sprouts. And when finally she rejoined her crew at the truck, Ruby was grinning broadly. She hoisted herself spryly into the back and then suddenly broke into happy laughter. I knew Jose Mondragon couldn't go through his entire life without attempting one great thing. Joe Mondragon, who after the initial euphoria wore off, had begun to wonder if his bean field might be such a great thing after all. He slumped at the kitchen table watching Nancy mop the floor. How come you use so much pneumonia every time you mop the floor? Ammonia, dummy, Nancy grinned, leaned the mop handle against the counter and fetched herself a tall boy from the fridge. She sucked in a third of her can and released a noisy, satisfied sigh. They sat in silence for a minute, Nancy smiling at Joe, Joe staring at his beer can and drawing pictures with his fingers in the puddles on the table. Stella Armijo called, Nancy said after a while. She said Bernie Montoya went to the state chota pendejo factory in Doña Luz about your bean field. Lydia Martinez called too, and she said that the Zopilote was going to fly down to the capital and talk with the governor about your bean field. Charlie Bloom called too. He thinks you two should talk things over some more. Joe shrugged, trying to appear nonchalantly caustic instead of scared stiff. I guess everybody's scared, Nancy said. I don't see what over, Joe grumbled. If you ask me, you're scared too. Speak for yourself, numbskull. I'm behind you, sweet. Yeah, that's what I need. Joe grinned a little in spite of himself. Your poisonous mouth behind me. That should keep me out of trouble, all right. All you got right now is my mouth. Nancy's eyes flashed in a fierce, tender way. So you better treat me with respect. Since when did you ever treat me with respect? Ever since I knew you, amor, she replied, fetching 2 more tall boys from the fridge. They sat there in silence, finishing up their second tall boys, moving into thirds. Outside it began to thunder a little. A few raindrops fell, then a wind blew the clouds back over the mountains. Joe had an urge to make love, but that was something he never did in broad daylight, not while it was still light out and work could be done. We owe on the pickup, the washing machine, the TV, and the refrigerator, Joe announced. Nancy was a little drunk. Well, screw yourself, Pity Jose. Go tell it to the sheep. Yeah, well, speaking of sheep, how are we doing for meat? Not so good. In fact, we don't have any. Yeah, well, I guess I'll go kill one of those kids then. Okay, I'll help. Reeling a little, they went out to the goat pen together. Charlie Bloom, the lawyer, was a tall, affable, sincere, although somewhat wishy-washy, and also quite tormented man. He spoke gently, had a soft smile, and an outward, relaxed, scruffy demeanor. When he deserted the East Coast after his divorce, he was a stunned human being, a 29-year-old man on the block and ready to give up. He drifted here and there and finally into a legal aid position in the southern rural valleys of Colorado. After a time, he timidly allowed honest attachments into his life again. First for the poor people in general whose rights he was defending, and eventually for one of them specifically, a gentle, skittish woman named Linda Romero. Bloom sincerely believed that by marrying this good woman, the product both of a tough lower-class upbringing and of a rich communal culture very unlike his own, he was breaking with an establishment past, a liberal conservative tradition that had always hung him up. To Bloom's private horror, he discovered almost immediately that far from being proud of, or even content with her Chicano heritage, Linda almost hysterically wanted out of her poverty-stifled past. And their dilemma was instantly this. He desired what he thought she had been, whereas she desired what she thought he had been. Immediately, both of them felt cheated, and they began to resent each other, although they kept their mouths shut. In the end, daring even to have children, the relationship devolved into a polite standoff. Bloom broke from the legal aid program and moved to Milagro to begin a more relaxed private practice, and more importantly perhaps, to help Linda set up a home safely removed from her family connections. Today the Joe Mondragon affair threatened once more to upset the tenuous stability of their lives. The client was a friend. The favor could not be refused. Despite Linda's cautious approach to people, she and Joe's wife had become more than just neighborly acquaintances. And although Bloom had always tended to shy away from Joe's hot head, he also admired Joe from a distance for the fighter that he was, and he had done a number of routine legal favors for the Mondragons, tax returns, mortgage, and loan agreements, plus several trips to the Chamisa County Jail to bail Joe out. In return, the Blooms had received bottles of homemade choke cherry wine, a leg of mutton, Halloween pumpkins, even bales of hay for their 2 Shetland ponies. Of course, Bloom thought on reflection, one of his worst blunders was the article on Joe's Beanfield he'd done for the Voice of the People. As soon as he saw it in print, Bloom wished to Christ he could pull it back, erase it, disclaim ownership, forget about the whole thing. Because at heart he felt he did not have the guts or maybe even the desire to put his money where his mouth was. He had grown too accustomed to playing things safe, and if he rocked the boat now, his home, his family life would be the first thing to collapse. In boca cerrada, Nancy Mondragon had once told him with a wry wink, no entran moscas, meaning if you keep your mouth shut, flies won't enter. But then all the time that Bloom had known Joe, he had understood that sooner or later the relationship was going to lead to trouble. So when Joe danced by to announce with pride what he had done, Bloom almost gratefully dropped an arm around his neighbor's shoulders, saying, "Don't worry, man. If they come down on you, we'll fight them every inch of the way." Though, of course, as soon as Joe left, he reconsidered, wondering, was he crazy to encourage such a hopeless and inflammatory act? Later that same afternoon, Bloom walked out back to survey his small, secure kingdom. There was his garden and the rototiller with which he turned it over. There was his irrigation boots and a spade for cutting water into his back field, or into his apple and plum trees, or into his gardens. There were 2 beehives supplying the Blooms with honey, and there was a chicken coop Linda and he had built together, and the chickens wandering in the yard. Bloom sensed all of it was terribly tentative, doomed, and he was afraid. One weekend afternoon, the lawyer was outside on his front lawn hacking away at some piñon with a dull axe when Joe Mondragon's pickup entered the driveway like a crippled jet fighter and made a 1-point landing just short of the woodpile. Straightening up, Bloom greeted Joe the way a timid cat might greet a very large, fat rat. Joe jumped nervously down from the cab, tossing a white package towards Bloom. What the hell is this? Goat meat. We just killed a cabrito. It's good. You'll like it. So what's happening? Picking up the axe, Joe ran his thumb along the edge. Jesus Christ. Why don't you sharpen your fucking axe, Charlie? You'll kill yourself trying to break wood with this thing. Joe fetched a file from his toolbox and began to sharpen the axe. You just came over to give me a package of dead goat? Bloom asked suspiciously, fearing the worst. Joe was no doubt going to make a lot of stupid mistakes and useless trouble for Bloom, which the lawyer was going to let him do because he felt guilty or noble or just too chicken shit to refuse a case that was doomed from the start. Joe turned the axe over, starting to file along the other edge. He said, Hey, Charlie, why don't you run down for me again what that law is about the water, okay? You know, just so I can get it straight in my mind. Bloom settled uncomfortably into an old wooden chair he had been meaning for months to refinish, and for the umpteenth time summarized the 1935 Interstate Water Compact and the state water laws in general. You understand, of course, that we've got about as much chance of winning this as a one-legged man has of winning an ass-kicking contest. Joe had listened intently, grinding hard with the file, and when Bloom finished, quit sharpening the axe. They sat silently for a moment. Eventually, Joe said, Look, I got some free time the next couple of days. You got anything else around here needs fixing? The lawyer shook his head. After all, the more he accepted, the more he would be obliged to offer, and he was already in well over his head. Joe leaned the axe against the wood pile. Well, you let me know when you got something around here needs fixing, okay? And I'll let you know when those bastards try to arrest me or send me a summons in the mail or something, okay? Behind the wheel of his truck, Joe catapulted back into the public road, leaving the lawyer engulfed in a robin's egg blue exhaust cloud. Bloom brushed the poisonous fog away from his face, went over to check the axe blade, and promptly cut his thumb. End of Side 1. Milagro Beanfield War, Side 2. How Charlie Bloom felt was nothing compared to the thoughts rolling in Herbie Goldfarb's brain. Herbie Goldfarb being a 22-year-old conscientious objector and VISTA volunteer from Brooklyn, New York. Herbie had reasoned upon graduation from CCNY, where he had majored in English literature, that he ought to take a year off and see the world. And if you did this by joining VISTA, you were much less likely to find yourself suddenly seeing that part of the world which included Vietnam. So that's how come Herbie found himself quite early one summer morning descending from a Trailways bus at Real store in Milagro with a guitar in one hand and a suitcase full of books and sneakers and T-shirts and Levi's in the other. And the mayor, Sammy Cantu, was supposed to meet him, didn't. About 10 o'clock, a pudgy, cheerful, prosperous-looking man wearing a suit and a bolo tie emerged from the late-model Plymouth, and on his way into the store tipped his cowboy hat and smiled, saying in English, "Hi there, how you doing?" By then, Herbie was desperate. Excuse me, sir. Maybe you can help me. I'm looking for Mr. Cantu." The man said, "Sammy Cantu, Bill Cantu, Meliton Cantu, Felipe Cantu, Amarante Cantu, Eloy Cantu, or Chemo Cantu?" Isn't your mayor named Cantu?" "Sure." The man really grinned. "I'm the mayor. My name is Sammy Cantu. What can I do for you, young man?" "Oh, Mr. Cantu, my name is Herbert Goldfarb. I'm the VISTA volunteer." Sammy Cantu squinted semi-suspiciously. "What's a VISTA volunteer?" You mean nobody told you I was coming?" The mayor shrugged. "Nobody told me. But that doesn't mean nobody told nobody. Maybe somebody told somebody, but they didn't tell me." "Oh, well, what do you think I should do?" Herbie almost burst out crying. "Well, you say you're supposed to live here for a while?" Herbie nodded. "Well, I know a place you could live if you're not too particular. It doesn't have no fireplace, but there's one of those monkey-wart tin stoves in there, and you could keep warm, and then there's a ditch that runs in the back of the house. Usually has water in it, and you could drink so long as nobody further up the line is using it in the field, and the rent probably wouldn't be very steep." "Oh, sure. That sounds great." Herbie proceeded to gush with thanks. He might have saved his applause for a more appropriate moment, though. The place was minuscule, had one small, very high-up window, no electricity, and was always cold. Skunks lived under the floorboards. The chimney of the tin stove wouldn't draw properly, and Herbie owned no truly warm clothes because, having associated Southwest with desert, he had figured the temperature would always be hovering around 85 degrees. Instead, he was living in a mud hut at 7,400 feet, and the temperature in June, even in July, dove into the high 30s and low 40s with regularity at night. When it rained, which was almost every day for a while, his dirt roof with sunflowers growing in it leaked. And when he cleaned the house on his first day in it, Herbie discovered 3 black widow spiders. Next week, their relatives moved in. Because the hut lacked electricity, he read by candlelight. His only furniture was a suitcase on end beside the window, on which he constantly perched, reading Malamud, Catherine Ann Porter, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Virginia Woolf, Henry Miller, and Joyce Carol Oates. One day his southern neighbor, Joe Mondragon, loafed over. Herbie was outside in his yard playing his guitar. Joe said, "Hey man, that's a pretty nice sounding guitar. Let me have a whack at it." Herbie handed the instrument over and Joe stroked a few chords. He couldn't play worth shit. But then he started singing, and Herbie had never heard a voice like that. Lusty and high, almost piercing, but especially melodic too, singing Spanish songs that to Herbie seemed rare and exotic. "Hey, this is a nice guitar. You mind if I borrow it? Just for a day? I want to sing my kids to sleep tonight." "Sure." Herbie was desperate for friends. Go ahead, keep it as long as you like. I don't play it that much anyways." "Well, when you want it, holler." That was the last Herbie saw of his guitar. It disappeared into the Mondragon house and never came out again. Maybe Joe had forgotten about it, or maybe the kids had busted it. If that's the case, Herbie mumbled to himself. Of course the Mondragons can't pay. So to save everybody embarrassment, Herbie never went over to ask for his guitar back. In fact, several times Nancy chided her husband, saying, "Jose, you have to give that poor boy back his guitar." But Joe poo-pooed her concern. "Hey, look, he said to keep it as long as I like. When he wants it back, he'll holler." Once a week, Herbie hitchhiked to Chamisaville for lunch with the other volunteers and for a shower at the KOA campgrounds a mile north of town. "Hey," one kid said, "I found this dynamite old guy who's teaching me Spanish." Another, a woman, gloated, "This really suave old lady is teaching me how to make tortillas." But basically they all felt sheepish and so out of their element it was crazy. "This is a great experience for all of us," Herbie said. "But what are we doing for these people?" When he returned to Milagro from these Chamisaville trips and hurried, hunched over to his miserable home, Herbie plunged back into literature with a vengeance, wrote long, sorrowful letters home to his girlfriend and to his parents, plinked imaginary lackluster rhythms on his forgotten, stolen, or busted guitar, and cursed these remote people in the remote village and especially himself for being unable to cope. Most of all, though, he cursed the skunks under his floorboards, whose perpetual low-key stink was driving him insane. So sat Herbie Goldfarb alone in his one-room house in the eye of a gathering storm, reading, the only inhaling and exhaling lump in Milagro, oblivious to the fact that something was beginning to get ready to hit the proverbial fan. Inevitably, Carroll Montana, the undercover state cop, paid a visit to Milagro. He came in on the north-south highway driving an unmarked state car, a beige four-door Ford Galaxy, which had a police radio and a .38 police special in the glove compartment, and a plan to case the joint, as it were. The agent nosed his car into a dirt road that twisted up the side of a hill past a small deserted elementary school, continuing on up to the white Milagro water storage tank. Parking in the tank's shadow, Carroll Montana sat behind the wheel of his car looking over the town. A compact, simple unit. Milagro was cut in two by the north-south highway, a curious division of green here and desert there. And there was Joe Mondragon's Beanfield, completely out of place to the west, an absurd green bauble in the otherwise desolated landscape slated to become a posh golf course. Carroll Montana started his car and swung around and down the hill to take care of business. In Milagro, only the Dancing Trout, the Forest Service headquarters, and the Enchanted Land Motel had private telephones. All other town residents were on an archaic system of party lines, a Tower of Babel built with electronic spaghetti. This made for a rumor mill and information network of substantial sophistication. Hence, practically the moment Carroll Montana's unmarked Galaxy cruised unobtrusively into Milagro, its progress was tracked with interest by many of the town's inhabitants. Nick Real called Sammy Cantu to say he had just seen a car with a chota-looking person in it go by and asked if the meeting was going to take place earlier than had been prearranged or what. Sammy Cantu assured him that the meeting would take place at the preordained time. This particular conversation was overheard by several villagers, and within seconds at least half the village, from behind various curtains, half-open doors, and trees, observed the police agent as he climbed up Capulin Hill, and still later as he drove back down for the meeting. Except for Bud Gleason, all 6 men present at the meeting were afraid of Carol Montana. Each man was nursing a beer, compliments of Bud Gleason. This is a simple matter, Montana said, or at least it should be a simple matter, and I'd like to go through it quickly because I don't want to take any more of your time than is necessary. We know that some people here in Milagro support Joe Mondragon despite the possible grave consequences, and simply to arrest and jail Mr. Mondragon for his flagrant illegal actions would probably cause more trouble than it would cure. What's going on, at least insofar as we see it down in the capital, is not something that most of you in this town fully understand. I think that Mr. Mondragon isn't acting entirely on his own. In fact, we have reason to believe that this Beanfield is not even Mr. Mondragon's idea, but a plot hatched up by lawyer Charlie Bloom. A few men nodded. Bud Gleason sneezed. The others sat quietly waiting. After 6 years, a relative newcomer, an outsider, is in cahoots with Joe Mondragon. Maybe, who knows, against Joe Mondragon's wishes, or maybe Joe Mondragon is an unwitting victim. I don't know. But anyway, Charlie Bloom has a plan for stirring up trouble in this town. And unless you people take measures to see that he and Joe Mondragon are discouraged from persisting in this matter, there are going to be serious consequences for Milagro. Bloom's planning to defend Mondragon if a hearing is held on this matter. They figure if they can get it to the hearing stage, they'll have at least a few more months for organization. If they can do that, they can recruit a lot of people on their side. Then Carol Montana leaned back. So that's the kind of person we're dealing with. There may be others too, so perhaps I should say that that's the kind of people who are using your neighbor, Mr. Mondragon, as a pawn in their lethal game. They were gathered in Joe Mondragon's yard, 10 men and the 2 women, Ruby Archuleta and Joe's wife Nancy. Nobody had called a meeting. Joe was working that morning on a tractor belonging to Ray Gusdorf, who, though an Anglo, spoke fluent Spanish and had been failing at farming and failing at trying to run sheep just about as long as anyone else in the valley. At about 10 a.m., Ray and 2 neighbors who had a stake in the tractor came over to see how Joe was progressing. Then Ruby Archuleta and her gang of Claudio Garcia and her son Eliu and Marvin LeBleu had stopped by to deliver some cut-rate tin roofing Joe was using and to discuss business. The other 4 present were Jimmy Ortega, a baby-faced kid who was always hanging around Joe's shop, helping out and learning a lot, his insolent, jiving friend Benny Mestas, Juan Mondragon, Joe's great-uncle who just liked to hang around watching the work and spitting tobacco at the cats or chickens that wandered through the yard, and Johnny Pacheco, a handsome, long-haired Milagro kid in his mid-20s who played in a Chamisaville rock band called the Hot Shots. Johnny had arrived 2 hours earlier with an amplifier almost as tall as himself that needed fixing. The topic under discussion that morning as Joe tinkered with the tractor's innards was Carol Montana's top-secret visit to Milagro and his top-secret meeting in Bud Gleason's living room. "I guess they're kind of worried down there," Ray Gusdorf said. "I guess somebody down there don't know whether to crap or get off the pot." Ruby said, "Probably they consider this some sort of organized resistance or symbolic act." "Who organized it? I didn't organize it. I didn't talk to nobody. If I'd have talked to anybody, they would have told me not to stick my neck out. Nobody organized nothing." Ruby said, "The thing is, they probably think we're united. They probably think we're all in this together. Look, it's my affair. Why is everybody worried about my affair? Look, I can handle it." "No, it's our affair," Ruby said. "It's your Beanfield, but it represents all our Beanfields. That dam is going to hurt all of us, and we're all going to have to pay those Conservancy district taxes, and there isn't anybody here who hasn't been screwed by La Divine." "Well, what does all that got to do with my Beanfield?" Joe asked. "Look, I didn't say I had a beef with a Zopilote." Gobercindo Leba, Ray Gusdorf's neighbor, offered an opinion. "But you see, the trouble you started will affect us all. They think we're united. That's how come they sent the Chota. They scare us so we wouldn't be united anymore. And if they knew you were almost alone, Jose, they would break you in half like a matchstick." "I ain't scared," Joe bragged. "I am," Ruby said. Everybody looked at her and there was a moment of silence. "Me too," Nancy admitted. "I'm scared." Johnny Pacheco was disturbed by the sudden seriousness of the moment. "It'll all blow over. Soon as you quit irrigating that useless field, everybody will forget about it." "Look, that field stays irrigated." For emphasis, Joe spat. "I don't know. Maybe you should quit doing it," another man said. "Maybe it isn't worth it." Ruby stood up. "I think it's worth it." No one else said anything. "And I think whether we know it or not that we're united," the body shop and pipe queen operator said. "I mean, How in God's name can a bunch of sorry types like us live together in the same damn valley for 300 years without being united? So there's got to be a meeting. What do you mean a meeting, said Joe. Of everybody. We'll open the church. Trouble, groaned Juan F. Mondragon. Here comes trouble big as an elephant to flatten us all. Milagro awoke early. Although the sun rose late because the town lay at the base of high mountains, most citizens were up long before the first bright rays fell across the narrow eastern fields of pasture hay and alfalfa. In the pre-dawn summer gray vehicles, most of them old pickups with their lights on, pulled out of their hard-packed, shiny dirt yards and began threading through the town's narrow back roads. One truck, this particular morning, crossed the highway and stopped near Joe Mondragon's bean field. Joe himself hopped out, grabbed a shovel from the back, and proceeded to divert water into his illegal field. And standing there during the blue pastel moments before dawn, Joe harbored feelings he hadn't had since he was a kid. He felt truly tough and arrogant, indestructible and happy. His bean field, purely and simply, was beautiful. And for a few seconds he experienced an almost embarrassing and awkward sensation of well-being and importance. Like he was king of the castle, el número uno. And if the illegal use of Indian Creek water brought down the wrath of the gods in the state capital, so be it. Fuck Carl or Ken or whatever the hell his first name was, Montana. Joe, all 5'6" of him, could kick the living shit out of all comers, and especially out of any two-bit pistol-packing chota. He would rip the tin stars off their marshmallow chests and chew them up in his mouth and spit them back in the shape of bullets. Stature. Maybe that's what Joe felt for the first time in a long time. Maybe that's what this beanfield could impart to the down-in-the-dumps dog-eared town like Milagro. Laughing, Joe seated himself on a dead cottonwood trunk near his beanfield, lit a cigarette, and watched the rattletraps heading down the highway toward menial jobs in Doña Luz and Chamisaville. A lousy bunch of chambermaids, cooks, and babysitters, Joe thought, and abruptly the strangest feeling he had ever known came over him. Something tender he had never felt before took over his bones, making him want to cry. Which was a hell of a spooky thing to happen to Joe. No getting around it, though. Suddenly he held a profound tenderness for his people, his gente, his bunch of inbred, toothless, tubercular, flea-bitten, illiterate vecinos, sobrinos, primos, cuates, cabrones, rancheros, and general all-around fregado de jodidos. Bernabe Montoya coasted his pickup to a stop in back of Joe's truck and got out. Joe waved and then watched suspiciously as the sheriff walked along the ditch bank up to the borders of his bean field. There was this fellow here the other day from the capital, Bernabe said. He talked with a group of, people from around here. Yeah, that undercover son of a bitch with the photographs driving around the unmarked galaxy? Hey, Jose, lots of people are worried about this little bean field. Oh, you don't say. I suppose you're going to keep on irrigating. Yes, sir. At that moment, a foot-long brown trout washed into the field and began floundering in the shallow water. Joe got up and grabbed it, bashing its head against a rock. Then, sitting back down, he took out his pocket knife and proceeded quickly and deftly to gut the fish. Joe swished the fish in the water a few times to clean it out and then sat back down again. They smoked. Joe got up once more and with his hoe diverted the water into a new row. This is just asking for trouble, the sheriff said. Look, this was my father's field, Bernabe. You know that, Joe pointed to a ruin. We used to live in that house. That was before, the sheriff said. Yeah, it was before you became sheriff, too, Joe said. I earn a living, Bernabe said. They smoked some more. So, why'd you come over here at 6 a.m., Joe finally asked, grinning. To help me irrigate? I came over to ask you to stop this before it gets out of hand. Yeah, that's what I thought. Fuck you. Look, I came over to warn you that some people in this town are going to try and stop you from irrigating this field. Yeah, well, other people are on my side too, Joe replied. This town is uptight enough, Jose. Already we're too much set against each other, so why make it worse? Look, this is my land. Bernabe lit another cigarette. Not too long ago we used to run together. Joe shrugged. Well, things change. As a friend, maybe you would quit irrigating this little no-account field? Look, why talk about what isn't going to happen? I won't protect you then, Bernabe said. You're going to mess up my job, you know that? I mean, I can't arrest you for illegally irrigating this field, and you know that and I know that. But if something happens to you or this field, I don't have to arrest anybody else either. I'm sorry, but I think that's the way things stand right now. You're trespassing on my property. Sadly, Bernabe backed up. What do you want to go and cause this trouble for, he asked. 15 minutes later, a state fish and game truck driven by Carl Abeta with Floyd Cowley in the passenger seat parked directly behind Joe's pickup. The two men sauntered over. Carl Abeta wore a gun. Heard you been fishing, Carl said. You got a license? Check your own records and you'll learn the answer. Joe picked up his hoe. You don't have a license. So what? We're going to have to fine you for that fish you got in your possession. Fish? Who's got a fish? We heard you had a fish. We got it from a good source. Hey, you, Joe said to Floyd Cowley. You're trespassing on my property. With the hoe, he advanced toward the man. You got until I count 3 to haul your ass onto the other side of that fence with your pal. Did anybody give you a warrant to search my property? Floyd backed under the fence. Carl dropped his hand onto his gun. You bastard, we'll get you. Oh, yeah? You and whose army? Without another word, the two walked back to their vehicle. Someone knocked on the door and Charlie Bloom went to answer. Standing on the welcome mat was the body shop and pipe queen owner, Ruby Archuleta. I don't got the time right now to come in, Ruby said. I just wanted to ask a favor. Sure, of course. What is it? There's going to be a meeting in the church about the Conservancy District and about the dam. We'd like your help, you know. Jose Mondragon showed me that article you wrote in the magazine, so we want you to come to the meeting and help us understand better this thing that is happening in the valley. Can you do that? What could he say? With every voice in his body, heart, and soul screaming, no, he said, sure. She smiled and shook his hand, telling him that when the word had been spread and the people had talked among themselves a little more, the meeting would take place and she would let him know exactly when that would be. Then she walked quickly back to her truck. The Milagro Church stood on the west side at the end of the original town square, fronting a wide open space lined on both sides by lovely old houses with wide portals. The town's long ago heart deserted now, dusty, dilapidated, and forlorn. But on this day an old man named Pancracio, Panky Mondragon, turned a large iron key in the massive rusted lock and pushed the door open. Panky gazed fondly at the simple church. A warm morning Ben Franklin stove occupied the centermost floor space. A few rows of rickety wooden benches were lined on either side of the stove. The altar was covered by a simple linen cloth. Above it hung a plain wooden cross. 2 arched, narrow, plain-glass windows were set in the side walls. Bluebirds fluttered high in the beams where they had nests, and Panky spent a few minutes scraping up their droppings with a trowel. As he was finishing this job, the people began to arrive. First, old Amarante Cordova, wearing his mammoth pistol, limped between ghost houses and down the plaza to the steps of the small mud-plastered church. Next, Ruby Archuleta and the rest of the body shop and pipe queen bunch arrived, followed closely by Joe and Nancy Mondragon, Joe's brother Cristobal and Billy, and Joe's shop rats Jimmy Ortega and Benny Maestas. The church began to fill. By the time Charlie Bloom arrived, perhaps 50 pickups and other vehicles in various terminal stages of decay were parked in the front of the church between the empty, crumbling houses. With his arms full of rolled-up hydrographical survey maps, Bloom got out and started for the church. Amarante Cordova was already talking to the approximately 75 people present. We didn't ask for this problem, Amarante croaked in his garbled Spanish. It came and it landed on us like an eagle lands on a prairie dog. But we aren't going to be like no prairie dogs. We're not going to dig a hole and hide our heads from the zopilote and the zopilotitos. We're going to fight. He paused and coughed and nobody stirred. It was hard to tell if they had heard, probably most of them being so old they were pretty deaf, and even if they weren't deaf, it was hard to tell what Amarante with his 3 teeth and ungrammatical butchered 93-year-old Spanish was saying in the first place. But everybody had the air of listening respectfully. Ruby Archuleta then took the floor. Listen, friends, you all know what's been happening in the valley. You remember when this church was the heart of a town that no longer truly exists. You remember the days when we were not rich, but when poverty was different, not a thing to be ashamed of, and we got along okay. You remember when our children grew up and stayed home and raised their children in Milagro. Well, now look at us. We're a congregation of old men and old women, and where have all our children gone? They stared at her impassively in absolute silence for a good 30 seconds. All right, she said. I had an idea before I came to this meeting. I was hoping maybe we could form ourselves into a grupo. I thought maybe we could call our group something like the Milagro Land and Water Protection Association. I don't know, but right now I asked somebody else to talk to us, and perhaps he can help us all understand these technicalities, and so we'll know what we're up against. Charlie Bloom went to the front. He faced the people. Looking at them, he translated their faces into a strength he had once hoped to somehow marry into. But then he had no desire to carve out some kind of niche for himself on the state police shit list because of their dead houses and their pathetic abandoned bean fields. But he was willing to do it anyways, and he really did not understand why. He was simply caught, trapped, wishy-washy, and doomed. Apologizing for his bad grammar, Bloom began to speak in Spanish, knowing even as he did so that his Spanish was much more formal and correct and classical than their own. Tracing the Conservancy district boundaries, the lawyer showed on the maps where the dam would be constructed, and then ran down who owned each piece of land within the district. He repeated himself, talking slowly, trying to make a very confusing thing simple and clear. He tried to make them understand technically what they all knew instinctively, that they were going to be taxed heavily for water which would be used mostly by a very few people, and those people by and large would be connected with the divine empire. Leaving the maps, then, Bloom talked about the history of the North. He named thieves and quoted statistics relating what he knew of the far past and of the near past to the present. In the end, he petered out. Their faces, paying perhaps close attention, perhaps not, never seemed to change. He stopped. ¿Hay preguntas? There were no questions. Incredibly, after an hour of talking, there were no questions. After thanking him, Ruby Archuleta asked, "Who wants to speak?" Tobias Arguello creaked erect. "We are a peaceful people," he said. "We don't play the Anglos in their own game because they are possessed by the devil. I think maybe if we are violent, we are un-American. I am a man of peace." Sparky Pacheco stood up and hat in hand nervously croaked. "These goddamn Anglo bastards like the Zopelote, they'll steal our land and everything else." Another old man said, "The Gabachos, especially their lawyers, are always deceiving us. They're all full of lies." Wait a minute," Onofre Martinez stammered, emotionally placing his only hand on Ray Guzdoff's shoulder. "This is my neighbor, and he's a gringo, and not even a little bit coyote, but I consider him to be of my people, and that white man over there who told us these things about the dam and the Conservancy and showed us the map, I consider him to be of my people too, even though he is a lawyer and speaks funny Anglo-Spanish you could hardly understand. But I believe he at least tries to speak the truth, and a lawyer who does that should get a big gold medal to hang around his neck. I don't believe this is a brown against white question. There are brown and white people on both sides, and I love my brother Ray here, who is a good neighbor and a good human being, and even if he isn't even part coyote. Let that be understood by everybody, please." And when he sat down, Onofre stared fixedly ahead, lips trembling, for he had spoken. "Who else wants to speak?" Ruby asked. "I want to speak," Joe's brother Cristobal said. "I nominate my brother Jose to be president of the Milagro Land and Water Protection Association." Joe leaped up. "Oh, no, you don't. No, not me. Hey, I ain't no president. I didn't start nothing, and I didn't call for this meeting. And I didn't ask for nobody's help with my bean field. What, am I crazy to ask for help from mental retards like you?" "It's because he won't ask anybody's help to help him that he endangers us all," Fred Quintana said. Joe spluttered. "Oh, Jesus Christ. As soon as this meeting is over, I'm going to start up my tractor and I'm going to drive it over to the west side and plow up that bean field and get all your people off my back." "You do, Jose," his wife Nancy threatened, "and I'll shoot you." "Look, that's my bean field. That's my private property. And nobody here's got a right to tell me what to do with my property." "Well, we'll kill you if you plow under those beans," Sparky Pacheco fairly screamed. There ensued a sudden silence as these words echoed in the church. By now half the congregation was standing and shouting at each other. Onofre Martinez stood up again. "Outside my evil son, the state chota is having a good laugh because we're all here growing donkey ears in here. And I get sick to my stomach whenever that chota son of mine has a chuckle at my expense. And if everybody doesn't shut up and sit down, I'm going to barf." For some reason, Onofre's attitude did the trick. "All right," Ruby Archuleta said calmly. Does anybody wish to talk quietly and in turn about this Milagro Land and Water Protection Association and about electing leaders? Tranquilinos, Yantete arose saying, These are probably good ideas, but we should think about them and talk among ourselves for a little while before deciding. All right, Ruby said, frowning warily. Then I guess this meeting is over. In the evening after the church meeting, Joe Mondragon finished eating supper, and with his 6-year-old son Larry in tow and a basketball under one arm, he walked up the road to the elementary school basketball court at the foot of Capulin Hill. Usually on summer evenings before dark there would be enough men and boys around for a game. But today only Benny Meistas and Jimmy Ortega and Joe's cousin Floyd Mondragon were on the court shooting baskets. After mumbling subdued hellos, Joe stood at the edge of the dirt court with Larry's hand tucked tightly into his own, reluctant to step out and begin. The sunset, rosy orange, flecked with pastel blues and streaks of lavender and blood, reflected gorgeously in those few school windows not yet broken. In the foreground, black silhouettes, the two boys and Joe's cousin moved in a lazy kind of athletic ballet, rose casually off their toes and shot, the ball leaving their delicately fluttering fingertips and hanging for a long time in the air like a black moon. The sun departed altogether, and the stars were scattered like luminous snowflakes in the pale, cloudless sky. They were all used to shooting baskets in this kind of white night. Shadows to each other, they flowed gently through the velvet air, momentarily at peace, working together, in tune. But then Joe noticed something. The others were deferring to him, allowing him the clean shot, giving him back the ball more often than they gave it back to each other. What was happening to his life? Ay, Chihuahua, he didn't want their respect. They could take their responsibility and shove it. Besides, he was afraid. The whole thing had gotten out of hand. Ruby Archuleta wanting to pass around a petition, and down in the capital the politicos and the chotas and who know who else trying to figure out how to brand his ass. What happened next none of the basketball players could later agree on, but a number of men suddenly burst from the darkness and beat the living daylights out of Joe and his cousin and the two teenagers. Straight off, Joe caught a chain right across his face and dropped like a sack of potatoes. For a second he blacked out. Both Benny Meistas and Jimmy Ortega were whacked with crude clubs, and Benny's nose was broken. Jimmy sustained a huge bruise on his arm trying to ward off the blows. Joe's cousin Floyd was banged once in the ass, and then he took off like an antelope down the hill, and the men didn't bother to chase him. And that was all. In half a minute the rumble had ended, their attackers disappeared. Little Larry was sitting in the sand pile crying. Joe was doubled over on the ground gasping, and Jimmy Ortega was wailing about his arm, and Benny Meistas, his face covered with blood, was propped up against a basketball pole, snarling. They wanted Jose, Jimmy Ortega groaned. The Zopilote must have sent those sons of bitches to get Jose. 2 nights after the basketball court rumble, while Joe and Nancy Mondragon were making love, a bullet crashed through their living room window and thudded into the other side of the bedroom wall, causing the plastic crucifix above the bed to fall on Joe's head. Jumping out of bed, Joe grabbed a rifle from the corner and charged through the front door. A car trying to get away was spinning its tires stuck in the mud. Joe aimed his rifle and fired, but nothing happened because he had failed to load up. Forgetting that the car's occupants were armed, Joe galloped towards the vehicle, planning to beat them all to a bloody pulp with the stock of his weapon. As he raced across the yard, however, their tires caught, and jolting clear of the gooey rut, the car plunged down the road. "You bastards!" Joe yelled, flinging his gun after them. It landed with a splash in the puddle. Lad Devine sat on the edge of a mahogany table. Jerry Grindstaff, one of his foremen, stood over by a window. Emerson Lapp, his secretary, was seated at an antique roll-top desk with a pen in his hand and a pad of legal-sized yellow paper in front of him. 2 state cops, William Kuntz and Onofre Martinez's shameful offspring, Bruno Martinez, were perched uncomfortably side by side on a delicate brocaded couch. Located across from them on a stiff divan were the 2 Forest Service personnel, Carl Abete and Floyd Cowley, and Horse Thief Shorty, Devine's foreman, was lounging in a wing-back chair with one leg dangling over an arm, smoking a cigar, basking in their hostility. Devine said, "I'd like to know who was the dumb jerk who took a shot at Joe Mondragon's house. I really would." There was a profound, maybe guilty silence in the room. Eventually Shorty said, "You don't suppose, do you, that it might have something to do with that Secret Service baboon your friends in the Capitol sent up here, do you?" "I don't know, and I don't give a shit," Devine said. But when people start throwing hot lead around this town like that, well, Christ. What do they think? I'm sinking my money into this Miracle Valley project for kicks? We're going to try and find out who did it, sir, Bruno Martinez said, practically choking on that sir, because he happened to dislike Lad Devine as much as the next man. Well, boys, I sure hope so, because that's all we need right now is a lot, or even just a little slap-happy stuff like that. As it is, if this gets out to some of my backers, as I see it, there's an inherent problem in all this. Shorty suddenly swung himself up so that he was seated on the arm of a chair. You want to pull the rug out from under the people in this valley, lad, and you don't really give a shit how you do it, with guns or with money or with state cops or with hired hoodlums. The problem is how to do it without pulling the rug out from under yourself, right? That's all. That's what's under discussion here. Very simple. Warily, Devine looked at Shorty, who was looking fearlessly back at him, and Devine realized that if he was going to make it safely through this mess, he would have to put a lot of his eggs in Shorty's basket. Shorty said, "Okay then, lad. Why don't you build maybe 4 more cottages down there by the tennis courts?" "Why should I? We don't need 'em." "You could hire maybe 15 people from town to work on them. And if you're paying them, they aren't going to slit your throat, are they?" Shorty was suddenly very angry at his boss, at the Dude Ranch, at himself. "Look, I'll go down there myself and offer Joe Mondragon 2 months of work he can't possibly refuse. Buy all your toilets, all your plumbing materials from Ruby Archuleta's Pipe Queen, and there's another few liters of the stain on your side. It's time to throw the peasants a bone, lad. It doesn't make sense to construct houses I don't need. That would just be money down the drain." "Why not call it insurance?" Shorty said, nodding as he walked out. Up north on that same evening, things were not quite so calm. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, when Joe Mondragon's rattletrap pickup skidded to a halt on the Strawberry Mesa Body Shop and Pipe Queen grounds, and Joe hopped out and strode swiftly up the slope to where Claudio Garcia and Marvin LeBleu and Ruby Archuleta were sitting on various stumps outside the house, quietly smoking. Joe nodded hellos to Marvin and Claudio and addressed Ruby. "I just had a talk with Horse Thief Shorty, who says they're going to build 4 more cottages down there at the Dancing Trout, and the Zopelote wants to hire me and maybe 15 other people. Shorty said I might even head the crew, and what plumbing they use and like that they're going to buy from here." "Well, why did you come to me?" Ruby asked. "Well, I guess mostly because Nancy thought I better." "It's just a bribe, Jose. Well, how many years have we been complaining among ourselves that those bastards won't hire locals for this construction? And shit, now he's doing it. Why should we refuse?" "Because of the situation. Because in this context, it's a bribe. He's hiring us to work only because he doesn't want us to fight him. So he can get his Conservancy District and his dam and his Miracle Valley golf course, and that will put all of us out of work for good." Joe wrote "fuck you" in the dirt and crossed it out and said, $3 an hour. "We should decide, Jose. You and me. We should decide right now." Joe looked up, startled at the tone of voice she had used, saying "we." "Oh, hell," he said. They waited. Joe bit his lip and wrote a few more obscenities in the dirt. "I don't know. I just don't know." "None of us really know," Ruby said. "Things just have to become different, that's all. And those cottages wouldn't make the right kind of difference. The whole plan is as destructive as Pacheco's pig." "Chihuahua," Joe said, abruptly standing and throwing his stick away. "I guess you're right. Maybe." With that, he said goodnight and strode swiftly down the hill, but once inside his truck, he felt so unfairly cheated that he damn near broke a finger clobbering the dashboard. End of Side 2. Side 3. Joe Mondragon owned 4 cows, 3 horses, and 10 sheep. He had a permit to graze 2 head of cattle in the National Forest from June through October. Only 25 years ago, Joe's father had had a permit to graze 100 sheep and 60 cows in the National Forest. Joe's case was not unique. Almost nobody, except for Eusebio Lavadier and Lad Devine, had the right to graze much more than a token animal up there in the tourist and timbering country. Given the situation, much illegal grazing went on in the Milagro area. The law read a person had to fence animals out, not in. This law held true for private property owners only, however, for if a private cow happened to wander out of its barren pasture onto the National Forest land, the cow's owner and not the National Forest Service was to blame. One day, a cow belonging to Joe Mondragon walked through a rusty fence surrounding Serafino Pacheco's back field and turned left into a lush meadow owned by the United States of America. and was immediately impounded by Floyd Cowley and Carl Abeta, who led it back into the stock pen behind the Forest Service headquarters in town. When Joe discovered his cow had flown the coop, he started screaming at Serafino, who said, "Joe, I let you put that sick cow in my field for nothing, so I didn't have no obligation to mend no fences." On his way back into town, Joe caught sight of the cow in the pen behind the Forest Service headquarters, and his heart almost stopped. Not only was the steer's freedom going to cost him $20 he didn't have, but also a permit head as well. So Joe went home and got drunk, and then he hoisted up his rifle and kicked open the kitchen door and swaggered out, murder humming through his blood. About halfway to Serafino Pacheco's house, Joe hit the brakes hard and skidded to a stop, and he just sat there in the middle of the dirt road thinking. Onofre Martinez's model green 1953 Chevy pickup came down the road towards Joe and lurched to a stop. Onofre got out and walked over to the driver's side of Joe's vehicle. "What's up, cousin?" he asked. "What's the matter with you?" Pues I had a cow in Serafino Pacheco's field and he let it get out. And now it's eating mildewed hay in that fucking corral in the back of the fucking Floresta office." Onofre whistled softly, almost gently, the way all people in Milagro had a tendency to whistle whenever they heard a disaster of such gigantic proportions. Then Onofre asked, "But how come you're sitting in the middle of the road like this?" "I don't know." Joe was puzzled by his own indecision. "I was going to go over to Pacheco's place to pay him back for letting my cow get loose." "What's the point of that? All of us are always paying each other back when the Floresta arrests one of our animals, and the Floresta just has a good laugh about what a bunch of lame-brained idiots we are." "Yeah, I know," Joe said. Onofre's eyes narrowed, growing a little sleepy-looking. "You think that someday somebody in this town would have the intelligence to lay the blame on where the blame deserves to be laid, que no?" "Yeah, I suppose so." Joe's eyes narrowed a little in that sleepy, thoughtful manner. 1/2 hour later, a small cluster of pickups belonging respectively to Joe Mondragon, Onofre Martinez, Ray Gusdorf, the Body Shop and Pipe Queen, and Sparky Pacheco appeared at the corral behind the Forest Service headquarters. And after Marvin LeBlue and Sparky Pacheco had opened the corral gate, Joe lassoed his cow. Both Floyd Cowley and Carl Abeta came running out the back door of the office shouting, "Hey, what the hell do you men think you're doing?" "I just came for my cow," Joe said. "No problem." And he just grinned. "Well, you'll have to come into the office and sign up for him," Carl said. "Have you got the $20? "You know what? This time I think I'll just take my cow without signing the forms or paying the $20, Joe said, casually tying the other end of his rope to the pickup bumper. Dropping a hand onto his gun, Carl Abeta called out loudly, "Come on, Joe. You know that ain't regulations." Then more softly to his partner, "Floyd, you hustle in the office and give Burnaby a call." Joe said, "Carl, this is my cow, and I don't got the $20 to pay for it, and you can take your regulations and shove them." Joe swung into his truck, leading the cow out of the corral, whereupon Carl Abeta drew his gun. Immediately, he realized it was 130% the wrong thing to have done. There were 8 weapons visible, either tucked in the crooks of their arms or arranged menacingly in pickup window racks. There followed a particularly quiet standoff. The group was assembled in this manner when Bernabe Montoya drove up. As soon as the sheriff assessed the situation, he sighed heavily. "Carl, why don't you holster that gun before somebody gets hurt?" "If I do, Bernie, they'll kill me." "Oh, cut the crap," Bernabe said. "I take it that this cow is what all the fuss is about." "We impounded that cow yesterday," Floyd Cowley explained. "And Joe over there, he refused to pay the fine, and now he's stealing it out of our corral. And until such time as Joe pays for that cow, the animal is government property." "Now, Jose," Bernabe said, "when was it that that cow got out of Pacheco's field? Do you remember?" "It was yesterday." Joe kept his eyes on Carl Abeta instead of shifting them over to the sheriff. "Well, perhaps you found that cow before it even ate a handful of government property." Bernabe turned to Carl. "And so maybe you didn't have no right to arrest it since it hadn't yet technically broken any of the rules. I don't think there's any way to prove that that cow had actually trespassed the legal amount of time on government land. So in all fairness, you ought to just let Jose take it home. So how about stashing that firearm, okay?" "Sure." Carl slowly and gingerly slipped the pistol back into the holster. "Of course, I wouldn't have shot nobody." The boys didn't say anything, so Bernabe prompted, "Hell, you boys knew that, right?" "Right," the boys mumbled slowly, reluctantly letting it out. "Okay, Jose, you take that skinny heifer back home or back to Pacheco's place and see if you can keep better track of it next time." With that, the men got into their pickups and started their engines and slowly pulled away from the corral. By way of an adios, Joe tooted his horn and waved gaily at the sheriff and the 2 Forest Service personnel, then led his cow up the road at a brisk trot. Bernabe grumbled, "I ought to arrest you, Carl, for pulling that gun. What's the matter with you, anyway?" "But did you see what they did? They just came by and took that cow. In 100 years, nobody ever did anything like that. I could take every one of those bastards to court." "Sure you could. And then when it was all over, I could mosey on down to the Campo Santo with a wine jug tucked under my arm and help them dig graves for you and Floyd." By noon on the day after Joe Mondragon stole his cow back from the Forest Service, Nick Real was able to confirm a definite run on ammunition. It began when Tranquilino Giantetta, even before opening the Frontier Bar, entered the store and purchased a box of 30-30 ammo, also a carton of 22 shorts. Next, Joe Mondragon himself came in asking for 2 boxes of 30-30s and 1 box each of 45s, 270 rifle shells, 22 longs, and 16-gauge No. 4 shotgun shells on credit. Nick informed Joe that as soon as he paid up the $96 he owed for groceries, he could have the ammo on credit. Joe glared at him. "Look, I gotta have that ammo, Nick. You know as well as I do that some son of a bitch put a slug through my living room window the other night, and I have to defend myself. When you deliver me the money for your bill, I'll be glad to put you on credit again." Joe snarled. "Well, maybe the next bullet will knock out that plate glass window you got up front, Nick." "Is that a threat?" "Look, nobody's issuing any threats. You just better sign me up for them shells, or who's telling you what kind of trouble might happen, that's all." Nick picked up the phone behind the counter and dialed a number. "Hello, Bernie? Nick here, over at the store. Listen, Jose Mondragon's over here and he wants to buy some bullets, but he hasn't paid up his bill, so I can't extend him any more credit. He's a little pissed off by this fact, and he's made a couple of what I'd call threatening statements. Maybe you'd..." "Fuck you," Joe said. "Forget it." "Did you tell the sheriff somebody shot a hole in your house?" Nick called after Joe. "Tell him yourself." Joe kicked the screen door open. "He probably fired the shot himself." While Joe was on the porch angrily thumbing 2 dimes into the soft drink machine, Bud Gleason's Chevy Blazer pulled up in front of the store. Bud swung down from behind the wheel, and Horse Thief Shorty ambled around from the passenger side. "Hello," Bud said, keeping his eyes straight ahead as he entered the store. "Hola, Jose. ¿Qué estás haciendo?" Shorty grinned cheerily, and he followed the real estate agent inside. Gleason purchased a box each of 270 rifle bullets and 357 Magnum pistol shells. Shorty selected a box of 32s on credit, and also some 22 longs. About 7 minutes after Bud and Shorty had left, Joe Mondragon barged back into the store, accompanied by 5 big, stern-looking people, 2 of whom carried rifles. "Hi, cousin," Joe said. "I came to purchase a little ammo." "Me too, cousin," each of the other men crowed. The biggest of them, 6'6" Claudio Garcia, approached the counter, opened the breech on his scope-fitted 30-06 and showed it to Nick. "See," he said, "it's empty. I ain't got no more bullets." Whereupon this entire group, excluding Nick, laughed heartily. Then they stocked up on ammo, and Joe gleefully affixed his signature to the charge sheet while Nick fumed. The men scuffled arrogantly onto the porch, shooting the breeze about how nice and quiet and peaceful and friendly it was here in Milagro. In due course, Bernabe Montoya walked in. "Let me have a box of 38s, the sheriff grumbled dejectedly. "You're lucky I got any left. Today I've been selling ammo at about 200 times the normal rate I usually sell it." "Oh, wonderful," the sheriff groaned. "That's really good news. That makes my day. Who fired that bullet at Jose's house the other night?" "I don't know who did that. I was home. In bed. I didn't even hear the report." "Sure. Everybody was home in bed." "I wouldn't know," Nick said. "I just know I sold enough ammunition already today to start our own little Vietnam here. You were at the meeting at Buzz with that Wyoming fellow? Montana. And screw him. The goddamn state police and the goddamn state engineers should keep their goddamn noses out of our goddamn affairs. Put the bullets on my card, Nick, and don't sell any ammo to Jose or any of those other bandits." "He's already come back," Nick said, "with 5 others, including Claudio Garcia, and 2 of them had rifles." "How much did you sell him?" "A couple of 30-30s and a 06, 38, 270s, like that." "Ay, Chihuahua." The Vista volunteer, Herbie Goldfarb, all sneakers and CCNY sweatshirt, came nervously down the road. He entered the store and ferreted nervously among Nick's wares, loading up on corned beef hash, bean dip, potato chips, powdered milk, and the like. At the counter, Nick had an idea, so he asked, "How's it going up at your place?" And Herbie, startled, said, "Oh, okay, I guess, I'm I'm having a little trouble getting started, but I imagine that's pretty soon I'll get in the swing of things. I'm learning Spanish, but I really haven't practiced on anybody yet. I'm still very self-conscious about it. Nick proceeded quickly to the point. Aren't you getting tired of those skunks at your place? Boy, you're not kidding, I'm tired. I can't sleep anymore. My eyes water all night long, and I feel sick 24 hours a day. Well, I think what you need is a gun. A gun? What would I do with a gun? Put those skunks out of their misery, for one. How about this .38? It belonged to a nice little old lady who never drove it over 40. Beg your pardon? A joke, Nick explained. But how would I kill the skunks? There's a hole, ain't there? Under the edge of the house somewheres? Well, that's how they got under there in the first place. What you want to do, see, is sit down a little ways away, round about supper time, and just blow them apart when they poke their heads out. Or hell, stick your hand down the hole and blast off a cylinder or two. Skunks are pretty smart. They're bound to get the idea. Oh, you really think this type of gun would be the kind to use on a skunk? Sure, you could use it on just about any kind of skunk. Well, gosh, I guess maybe I'll buy it then. Herbie's heart was racing like a stuck throttle. Would you show me how to load it and how it works and everything? 15 minutes later, Herbie Goldfarb, pacifist, conscientious objector, Vista volunteer, walked out of there like a young man who had just lost his virginity. At home, having opened and drained the beer, he straightway loaded the gun, kneeled at the larger of the two entrances to their lair, shoved down his arm and leveled the gun as best as he could and pulled the trigger. The first explosion hit him with a wallop of a bomb, the sheer volume of sound scaring him so much that he shrieked. Yet somehow he managed to pull the trigger again, driving a slug up through his own wooden floor. And with the third shot, the gun kicked right out of his hand and he tumbled over backwards, expecting the house or at least the nearest wall to collapse violently on his head. In the Pilar Cafe, Bernabe Montoya knocked over his coffee cup, spilling the hot fluid on his egg salad sandwich as he cried, "Oh shit, it's beginning," and he dove off his stool. Grabbing the .38, Harlan Bechtel leaped after the sheriff out the door. Bernabe swung up behind the wheel of his pickup and just made it into the passenger seat as the sheriff gunned the truck. They careened into the narrow lane that led up to Joe Mondragon's house 300 yards up the road. Tires squealing, they thundered into Joe's yard, and as they did so, Joe bolted out of his front door, hunched over and running fast, carrying a rifle like a Marine dashing behind a huge cottonwood. Even before Joe reached the tree, however, Harlan Bechtel was diving out of the truck, his .38 blazing in Joe's direction. Bernabe tumbled out of his door, tripping and crashing belly first into the dirt. Plunging around the tail of the pickup from the opposite sides, the two men collided head-on, each of their weapons, Harlan's .38 and the sheriff's rifle, discharging, though somehow missing both of them. "It's Armijo," Joe screamed from the tree. "He shot at me! What are you shooting at me for?" "Where is he?" Bernie hollered. "I don't know. He's over there somewhere, though. He fired 3 times. "Are you hurt?" "No, but no thanks to you, goddamn you." "What would Armijo be doing this for?" Bernabe gasped. "I don't know. He shot 3 times, Joe blurted. "I never even saw him. I was watching TV. Maybe he's lying on the roof, the bastard." Actually, Pancho Armijo and his wife Stella were lying on the floor beside their telephone table. Pancho with a rifle in his hands and Stella manning the telephone. Stella dialed to Pilar. Betty Apodaca answered. "Where's Bernie?" Stella sobbed. "He just ran out," Betty babbled. "There's a shooting over at Joe's and the Armijos." "I'm Stella Armijo," Stella wailed, "and I don't see Bernie around here anyplace." "But where are you?" "On the floor beside the telephone table." "Well, tell Pancho to look out the window." "But they'll shoot him in the head," Stella cried. "They'll shoot him in the head," and she hung up. At the store, Nick dialed the Dancing Trout. Emerson Lapp answered. "This is Nick at the store. They're shooting it out over Joe Mondragon's. Bernie and Harlan just went over in Bernie's pickup truck. I heard 6, 7 shots at least. You better get Mr. D." Emerson Lapp ran outside. A pickup with Horse Thief Shorty at the wheel and Jerry Grindstaff and a cowboy named Hugh Slocum beside him, both holding rifles tensely between their knees, barrels pointed at the ceiling, and with 2 younger hands, Tommy Gallegos and Richard Tafoya, in the back clutching guns, roared by, gravel flying. "Where are you headed?" Emerson Lapp called. "There's a gunfight down at Jose Mondragon's," Tommy Gallegos yelled. The Dancing Trout pickup rattled past Nick Real and skidded to a halt behind Bernabe Montoya's pickup. And the 5 men who hopped to the ground were surprised to find Joe Mondragon hale and hearty with the sheriff and Harlan Bechtel, all their guns pointed toward Pancho Armijo's cozy little farmhouse. "Pancho," Bernabe yelled, "cut the shit and walk out of there. Hands on your head. Toss the weapon out in front of you." "Bernie," Pancho shouted back, "is that you?" Who the fuck do you think it is? You just come out with your hands on your head, Pancho. Where's Jose? Pancho yelled back. He's right here. He's all right. You didn't hit him. I didn't hit him. Of course not. I never shot at him. He shot at me. I didn't shoot at anybody. You come out of there, and then we'll see what's what, Bernabe called. With 10 guns trained on his front door, Pancho Armijo and his wife, their hands clasped atop their heads, emerged babbling Hail Marys into the bright sunlight. The sheriff, Joe Mondragon, Harlan Bechtel, Horse Thief Shorty, Jerry Grindstaff, Hugh Slocum, Richard Tafoya, and Tommy Gallegos, 3 old men from the frontier, and Nick Real advanced slowly toward the Armijos, and as they did, they passed the corner of Herbie Goldfarb's bungalow. There was Herbie, seated in the dirt at the side of his house, banging his head to try and drive the high-pitched, scary ringing from his ears. He looked up at them all puzzled, and he lifted up his right hand gingerly, trying to wiggle the thumb, explaining to Bernabe Montoya, to them all, I was trying to shoot the skunks under my house, but I think I sprained my thumb. About 2 hours after the gunfight at Herbie Goldfarb's, Charlie Bloom saw Ruby Archuleta's plumbing truck pull up outside his house. It could only spell trouble. Yet how to escape? He let her knock before opening the door. Can I talk with you a moment, Mr. Bloom? Sure, come on in. Ruby scraped her feet carefully, flicked a cigarette butt away, entered the kitchen and sat down at the table. I need some help to write a petition. We're going to pass around a petition, you know, against the dam and the Conservancy District. Also, I want to know if we can hire you. Who's we? The Milagro Land and Water Protection Association. Are you incorporated? In what ways do you exist? Ruby smiled toughly and leaned back, tapping her head. Up here we exist, Mr. Bloom. Well, that's not enough. Well, it's a start. How do you plan to grow? Well, nobody knows for sure. Some are very bitter and others are very angry, and everybody's afraid. To fight this thing takes money, and we have no money, and people are afraid of anything that calls for money. But they understand what's happening here. By talking at the meeting, you help. Still, they don't trust me, and they don't trust you. They don't even trust themselves. Many think it's hopeless to oppose the Zopilote. But there is Jose's example, and that won't go away. Maybe nobody will sign my petition. I don't know. We'll see. But it's a first step, you know. Because of Jose, and because of your talk in the church, I think some people will sign this petition. And once they sign this petition, it will be possible to form as a group. And once we're in an organized legal group, then maybe we can tax ourselves enough to pay you to help us, if you will. Bloom smiled, sighed. This petition you're going to circulate, what will it be, basically? Just against the Conservancy District and the dam? Sure. And you plan on sending it where? To the governor, to our representatives in Congress. You know, that's a useless, almost foolish gesture. I mean, it's a complete waste of time and energy. The point isn't to change their minds, Ruby said. The point is to take an action together. Okay, but I'll bet you $5 that if you take that petition over Joe Mondragon's house this afternoon, he won't sign it. That's a bet. Ruby smiled at him almost pityingly. Now let's begin. An hour later, crestfallen Ruby returned, and without a word handed over a $5 bill. Bloom laughed. Ruby shrugged. Then she offered him a clipboard, holding a copy of the petition. What about you, Mr. Bloom? If you're defending Jose, and if you're willing to work for us, you should sign. Bloom stared at the petition. Then, not wanting to make the commitment, he took the cheap ballpoint pen she offered and signed his name. Ruby grinned. From now on, she said, I'm going to call you Charlie, Carlito, and you just call me Ruby, okay? The lawyer smiled sickly and nodded, thinking, don't do me any favors. I'll tell the people they can trust you, Ruby said. Bloom wanted to say, no, don't tell them that, because they can't. But he couldn't say it. He could not really think of a proper way to react at all. Then all of a sudden he truly hated her guts and Joe's guts for holding him up, for jamming him back into a corner from which there could be no escape. For years the Pilar Cafe basement had been decorated more or less like an Edwardian brothel. Off in a corner a small bar carried essential bottles of bourbon, scotch, and some wine. A little refrigerator was always well stocked with beer. On any late afternoon or evening, up to a dozen serious men might be seated around a large round table intently playing cards. And it was the habit of these men to wager rather heavily upon the cards they held. In short, the Pilar Cafe's basement was a gambling den. By and large, only regulars inhabited this casino. Harlan Bechtel, and of course Bud Gleason, the Enchanted Land motel manager Peter Hirshorn, and occasionally Peter's brother Jim, Lad Devine's mouthpiece, drove up for the game. Nick Real spent every other night in this den of mild iniquity, as did Carl Labeta and Floyd Cowley, the Forest Service personnel, and also Eusebio Lavadier. Rounding out this nefarious who's who of Milagro gambling were the two state cops Bruno Martinez and Granny Smith. One night, almost 150 clean greenbacks glowed in the center of the table, waiting for the lucky winner to claim them all. And just as Harlan took a hefty glom at the card giving him a full house in 6s and 7s, the stairway door clattered open and 3 desperados entered the room, changing the name of the game from poker to armed robbery. "Anybody moves and all of you will be kissing worms tonight," the first person in the room announced calmly, brandishing a double-barreled over-and-under sawed-off shotgun. This peppery person, barely over 5 feet tall, with a strange, raspy voice, wore a black cowboy hat pulled low, a woman's stocking, and a red checkered bandana over the face, a puffy dark blue ski jacket, dungarees, and plain brown cowboy boots. The man behind the sawed-off shotgun, who was 6 feet tall and dressed in disguise the same, brandished a pump shotgun, which he waved a little. Okay, I want everybody's hands in sight, on the table, palms up. Okay, now draw that stack over near the edge of the table by your right arm. Okay, everybody raise their right hand just a little bit. And using this right hand, you will all reach into your back pockets and remove your wallets and set them very, very quietly on the table. The men did as they were told. The sawed-off shotgun chuckled. Splendid! And the pump gun moved swiftly around the table, plucking swag from the wallets. The desperados netted over $2,000 from the gamblers who had been planning to play all night long. The 3 gunmen backed towards the door while the sawed-off shotgun spoke. "You try to find out who is responsible for this heist, and we'll blow the whistle on this little gambling joint, and who was here tonight to every newspaper, publication, and civic crusader we can uncover in the northern half of this state." With that, they flitted away. "Okay," Peter Hirshhorn said. "I'm going upstairs to notify the police." "The police is here," Bruno Martinez growled. "This just never happened," Granny Smith insisted. "Does everybody understand that?" Several days later, a deposit of over $2,000 in the name of the Milagro Land and Water Protection Association was made in the Doña Luz branch of Jim Hirshhorn's and Lad Devine's First State Bank. Jerry Grindstaff was just negotiating the curve around Gray Goosedor's small spread when he noticed a freshly painted and inscribed wooden cross beside the road. In normal times, Jerry G. probably wouldn't have given the cross a tumble. Such roadside markers were a common occurrence. But something about this particular cross made the foreman do a double take about 30 yards below it. He sped back to the roadside marker and gazed for a full 60 seconds at the insolent inscription on the cross. "Passerby, pray for the soul of Zopilote Divine." That same night at 10:42 p.m., a call came into the state police headquarters at Doña Luz to investigate vandalism at the state trout hatchery. On arrival, they found the hatchery head, Glenn Wesley Gore, standing beside the lunker pool with a hurt and extremely puzzled expression on his face. "What's the problem, Glenn?" Bruno Martinez asked. "Seems pretty quiet around here." "Look at this friggin' pool, will ya?" They looked. Bill Kuntz whistled softly. "Where's all the fish?" "That," Glenn moaned, "is for me not to know and you boys to find out." Removing his hat, Bruno scratched his head. "You mean somebody came in here tonight and stole all these fish?" "You bet that's what I mean." "What in Christ's sakes is somebody going to do with all that fish?" "Well, they ain't going to use them for fertilizer," Glenn said. A few minutes later, as Kuntz and Martinez drove off the hatchery spur onto the highway, Bruno said, "Hey, Bill, isn't that a fire up there? Say, just around the Milagro turnoff?" "Beats me." "Hey, wait a minute. Isn't that just about where Lad Devine's Miracle Valley sign is located?" When they arrived, everything except the concrete base of the sign was demolished. Worried, haggard, and fitfully puffing on a cigarette, Bernabe Montoya separated himself from the group of about 100 onlookers and trudged over to the state cops. "Who did it?" Kuntz asked. "Now, Bill," Bernabe said, "if I knew that, I wouldn't be standing around here with the rest of this town warming my nuts and toasting marshmallows." "We just came from the hatchery," Bruno said. "Somebody stole all the fish out of the lunker pool." "So what we're all supposed to be on the lookout for, I suppose, is somebody driving a truck full of fat fish and gasoline cans, que no?" "Let's go in and arrest Joe Mondragon," Kuntz said. "That's what whoever set this fire would love for you to do," Bernabe said. "The situation is such in this town that all we have to do is pick up Joe Mondragon on some trumped-up charge or even a legitimate charge, and people will just line up and start shooting at each other." Joe Mondragon, off on a wood run, drove like a maniac over the Mesa's pothole dirt roads, a beer in one hand, the radio blasting. Nancy sat morosely beside him, holding a six-pack minus one tall boy in her lap. Joe bapped his horn angrily at the cows on the road, and because they were Eusebio Lavadier's cows, he wouldn't have minded plowing into a couple of them either. Joe suddenly braked the truck, grabbed his 30-06 from the window rack, and banged open his door. "Where are you going?" Nancy asked. "I'm going to shoot one of them bastards' cows." "You do and you'll get caught, and that's what they want, Jose. You'll see." Walking within 15 yards of a pregnant cow, Joe bolted a bullet into the chamber. But Joe no more could have shot a cow he wasn't going to eat, much less one that was going to drop a calf, than he could have refused a free beer. At the same time, he was out there, having announced in no uncertain terms what it was he had planned to do. So he compromised, opting to scare the shit out of the cow, pulling off 3 rapid shots that sprayed dirt and pebbles and bits of dead sage branches up into the cow's face. Back in the truck, Joe felt better. Nancy stared noncommittally ahead. The sage became dotted with a few junipers, and then suddenly stumpy pinon trees surrounded them as they lurched onto an old railroad trestle road. Joe swerved off the beaten path where the busted trees lay all about. Without a word, they both hopped out and set to work. Joe scavenging bigger logs that burned well in his shop's heater, Nancy gathering smaller branches that would fit easily into the kitchen stove. Within an hour, the pickup truck was stacked so high one more log probably would have snapped a spring or cracked the axle. Joe fetched the cigarettes from his shirt pocket, tossed one to Nancy, and lit them both. A strange but harmonious feeling infused them. That is, until Nancy asked, "How come you won't sign that petition Ruby Archuleta keeps bringing over?" "Because every time we sign something, we sign to wear our noses, our ears, even our testicles." "Well, this is different. I think we should stop on the way back so you can sign, Jose. You started all this. It's time to quit monkeying around." "Oh, shut up," Joe whined, and for some odd reason that ended the conversation. On the way back, Joe drove slowly. On a north-south highway, instead of turning north toward Milagro, Joe steered south, pulling off a mile down the road into the Strawberry Mesa Body Shop and Pipe Queen complex. Brushing metal bits from her hair, Ruby walked over to the truck. "What's up?" she asked, releasing a warm smile. I guess I'll sign that petition." "It's up at the house. Follow me." In her kitchen, Joe affixed his signature to a handwritten petition claiming that "we, the undersigned residents of Milagro, representing the Milagro Land Water Protection Association, were opposed to the formation of the Indian Creek Conservancy District and the Indian Creek Dam, essentially because they were costly projects designed to aid the few rich landholders in town, projects that the poor people could not afford." There were only about 10 or 12 names before his, and the whole thing made Joe terribly uncomfortable, as if somehow he had just signed up for a hitch in the army or in a jail cell. He was being trapped into going farther than he had ever intended to go. In the truck going home, Joe suddenly exploded. "Shit!" "What?" Nancy asked. "Just shit." It was late in the day, and Bud Gleason had to drive down to Chamisaville. As he was about to slip behind the wheel, he heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tiny gunshots pop from all over the west side, and directly on the heels of the 6th pop, he heard a high-powered rifle explosion that echoed across town and ran right up Milagro Canyon into the Midnight Mountains. And he didn't need anybody to draw him a picture in order to understand that all of a sudden, and finally, the chickens that had been fluttering around Milagro for the past few months, for the past 150 years, had come home to roost. Herbie Goldfarb had never owned a car, but after a while he became convinced that if he was ever going to do anything in Milagro, he needed mobility. So he begged his father for bread, and early one morning he clambered joyfully aboard a Trailways bus bound for the capital. Once in the big city, Herbie headed directly for Joe Feeney's Conquistador used car lot, and following an hour of indecision, fear, cold sweat, and haggling, Herbie drove onto the capital's main thoroughfare behind the wheel of a 1956 two-door Chevy convertible with a cracked engine block and a leaky radiator. It was a gorgeous, sunny, dry day. The top was down and the volunteer's heart was buoyed up. He sang along with a rock and roll on the radio. 10 miles into the trip home, a red light on the dash suddenly glared. Pulling over into a gas station, Herbie discovered that his engine was out of oil, and he fed in 2.5 quarts. Then he noticed a drip-drip exiting from the block, and the garage attendant sold Herbie 3 extra quarts of oil for the remainder of his trip north. A little farther on, while climbing a steep hill, the radiator overheated. and Herbie had to coast into the only gas station within 5 miles, where the radiator exploded and boiled over. Eventually, the slightly frazzled volunteer calmed it down and filled it up with cool, fresh water, and he was able to hit the road again. Further on, he stopped again to pick up a hitchhiker, a hefty young woman with a broad and sensual face, such blue eyes and dirty blonde hair and pigtails. Flinging her pack and guitar in back, she announced, "Hi, I'm the Butterfly of Love. Want to turn on?" The girl wore a peasant blouse and a nondescript ankle-length skirt. Her calloused and dirty feet were bare. Herbie's spirits and also his carnal lust soared. They chugged along at 50 miles an hour with the radio blasting and the late afternoon wind whipping their hair, getting high on her Colombian two-toke. After his third drag, Herbie looked at his passenger and grinned, and she grinned back at him, and Herbie let his right hand float over and settle against one of her huge peasant breasts as he asked, "Where are you headed?" The Butterfly of Love giggled, flinging her head back gaily, and she said, "Oh, you know, like just wherever the roll of dice takes me." And they laughed heartily together. Herbie suggested, "You can crash with me if you want." And she answered, "Oh, far out. That'd be groovy." And Herbie thought, "Oh, Jesus Christ, everything I always dreamed about is finally happening to me." When they reached Milagro, they headed up into the canyon, following the road for about 3 miles. They pulled off into a little grassy area beside a stream. They faced each other. Herbie tugged the peasant blouse down over her breasts. A mosquito landed. She brushed it off. Herbie slapped his cheek and squashed an insect that was punching a hole in his ear, and then brushed 3 more off his arm. His fingertips began to serenade her breast, and she murmured, "Ouch!" and clouted a fat mosquito. Then Herbie had to remove his clutching paw from her bosom in order to crucify a mosquito that had punctured his lip, which is when she said, "What the fuck is the matter with this place? It's crawling with bugs." Herbie had a sensation that for the rest of his life he was going to hate the Southwest more than he had ever hated any place before or would ever hate any place again. Wrenching away from each other, they slapped cheeks and heads. She hitched up her blouse and croaked, "Hey, man, let's get out of here." Desperately, frantically, Herbie shifted into reverse and without looking backward, furiously popped the clutch, causing his wonderful convertible to bolt back into the dirt road and directly into the rattle-trap pickup barreling along at a high rate of speed. Herbie's car spun around so that the passenger side collided with the pickup truck's rear end, knocking the convertible off the road sideways and propelling the Butterfly of Love out her door into a somersault on the road. Miraculously, nobody was hurt. Joe Mondragon, carrying a rifle in his left hand, leaped from the pickup and ran around it, screaming obscenities in Spanish. When Herbie realized who he had backed into, he clapped his hands over his eyes, waiting to be executed. When Joe realized who had clobbered his truck, he unleashed a string of gory expletives. Then he turned tail, galloped up the slope into the woods, and disappeared. The girl stood up, gestured obscenely at the car, and angrily retrieved her pack and guitar from the rear seat. I'm sorry," Herbie mumbled through his hands. "If you give me your pack, I'll carry it back to town." "Oh, no, you don't," she growled. "You stay away from me, man. I think you got the worst karma of anybody I ever met." And she took off down the road, leaving Herbie moaning into his hands. As the 10 o'clock nightly news was ending, Carol Montana's phone rang. "Gil?" "Yeah, listen. You know that guy up in Milagro? He shot somebody a couple hours ago. A fellow by the name of Pacheco, owns a pig, got into his field. Shot him once in the chest with a 30-06. He's not dead yet, but he could croak. Right now they should be transferring him up to St. Clair's down here, but nobody thinks he'll make it." "Oh, yeah? Well, where are they holding him on Dragon?" "They're not. He's gone. By the time anybody arrived, he'd flown the coop." "Which way?" "They asked around. Everybody pointed to the mountains. They found his pickup at the end of an access road. He ran it into the back of a 56 Chevy convertible." "Anybody witness the shooting?" "2 men. Mondragon showed up at the Beanfield, found the pig in it, went to his pickup and got the gun from the rack, then shot the pig 6 times from about 10 yards. That was about 5:30. "And then?" "Nobody knows how Pacheco found out about it. That Pacheco, he lived alone 6-7 years ever since his wife died. I guess he really loved that pig. I mean, he went hunting for Mondragon with a .22 pistol. And when he found Mondragon irrigating that bean field with a dead sow off in the corner, he stopped and ripped off a chamber load at our hero from a distance of about 30 yards. "And well, did he hit him?" "You kidding? That's another thing Pacheco does, apparently. He drinks. He really stokes it away." "So he missed 6 times. "You betcha. And I guess around the fourth miss, Mondragon picked up his rifle, sighted carefully, and pulled the trigger. Yeah, well, how come he ran? I don't know. At least nobody can piece that one together, except maybe he figured nobody saw it, and he knew no cop or no judge was going to believe his story anyways. Maybe he had a feeling it was some kind of setup. So a couple of the local boys and you were supposed to go in after him in the morning. Damn, this isn't right at all. Maybe it'll work for us, man. Every cloud has a silver lining. It's too much publicity. If this thing gets away from us, it's as full of explosives as an atom bomb. Well, thanks for calling. Immediately upon hanging up, Carol Montana began to move.
The room was stale from smoke. A few beer cans were scattered.
End of side 3.
How many people we have signed up for the posse? Carol Montana asked. 30, maybe 35 men, all with guns, Bernabe said. The people here, Chucho said after an uncomfortable pause, they don't think Joe Mondragon's been in these mountains for a long time. They feel he's going to stick to the established routes, the tourist trails. We got to figure he's not going to stray too far. We got someone keeping an eye on his wife's house and on that lawyer's house, too. Mr. Martinez and Mr. Smith are probably going to visit the wife, and maybe even the lawyer, Mr. Bloom, sort of surprise like tomorrow sometime, just to make sure they don't have any guests we're looking for. As for me, said Trucho, I got other things to look after now. I'm going back to the capital. I'm going home. He nodded perfunctorily and walked out. We're going to assemble where in the morning? Carol Montana asked. Right here, Bernabe said. The agent sat down. Quietly, he warned, if our 35 guns kill Joe Mondragon tomorrow, it's only going to be the beginning of a real bad time. A real bad public time, and a real bad time all around for this little town. You know what I mean? Uneasily, they broke up. Carol Montana waited in his car until the others had left, then moved slowly out the muddy driveway. But instead of going west towards the highway, he turned right, aiming right towards the mountain, and once again he climbed the winding road up to the water tank. There, with the radio off so that its static would not disturb his concentration, he gazed out the open window at the town. Somber but not thundering clouds remained stationary near the eastern mountaintops behind him, and Carol Montana wondered if it had either hailed or snowed in the high country, not an uncommon occurrence even in July. Then, as the wide sky became translucently pink and azure with the moon still shining brightly from the center of it, he drove down the hill to Bud Gleason's house. 5 cars were parked in the yard when he arrived. Bernabe Montoya detached himself from the group and walked over to the unmarked car. Squatting beside the front door so that his head was below the agent's, he said, "That field over there, somebody irrigated again last night." "Oh, yeah? Who did it?" "How should I know? There's something else, too. They took the pig, Pacheco's pig." "Nobody saw anything?" "You must be kidding." Carol Montana looked at the sky. It was dawn. It was time to start hunting Joe Mondragon. I'm going over to see Nancy," Bloom said to his wife. "Maybe you better come along." "I don't want to, but you go. She's your friend. They're your clients." "Well, goddamn." Bloom stopped himself from slamming the door, closed it gently, and crossed his front yard. He could smell fresh cut hay and alfalfa. Their immediate next-door neighbor, Eusebio Lavadier, was on a tractor nearby starting his second cutting. That bastard Lavadier, serenely cutting hay while Joe Mondragon fled for his life, struck the lawyer like a brutally unfair blow. Bloom felt sorry for himself. He wanted to lie down in this field, curl up in the green womb in the dazzling aura of those mountains, growing warm and drowsy under the sun, abdicating all responsibilities and sleep. Instead, he had to push on, face Nancy, console her, advise her, be strong. Nancy opened the door before he knocked. "Hi, Charlie," she said. "How you doing this morning?" "Oh, so-so, I guess, thanks. I don't suppose Joe is around, that I might talk to him." "Oh, he's up in the mountains." Yeah, I know, I heard all about that. I've got a tendency not to believe all I hear around here, though," Bloom said. Halfway to the living room, he suddenly stopped. 10 old men, all wearing cowboy hats and faded jeans and boots, each with a rifle butt held against the floor between his knees, were sitting around watching TV. Nearby, the 3 Mondragon kids were stretched out on the threadbare carpet, intent on the tube. "Jose just thought me and the kids should be protected in case anything funny developed," she smiled. "This isn't funny, Nancy. There's 30 or 40 heavily armed men up there in the forest looking for Joe. Half those men, I bet if they see him, they'll shoot him on sight, claim it was self-defense, and get away with it because everybody knows about Joe's temper." "The thing is," she said, flippantly lighting a cigarette,
They aren't going to find Jose. You can be assured of that. Well, the longer he's gone, I think the worse it's going to be. In another 10 hours, somebody like Lad Devine is going to make an offer of $1,000 or maybe more for information leading to Joe's arrest. With that kind of price on his head, you know there's going to be some people digging around the Campo Santo looking for Joe. So what happens if he turns himself in? Nancy asked angrily. The Chotos will kill him. They won't be able to do it if he's with me. Well, excuse me for laughing, but that's bullshit. The cops will spit in your face. I'm his lawyer. I'm trying to help you both. Legally, so far, he's got all the grounds in the world to stand on. There's no doubt it was self-defense. But the longer he stays out, the more likely we are to have a tragedy in this town. This has been building for a long time. Everybody is just too damn uptight. This could be suicide. To fight for what you believe in isn't suicide, Nancy said. Or cut out all that stupid patriotic bull. Bloom felt like crying. It was hopeless. Nancy stood up. Come here, Charlie. She opened the kitchen door. I want to show you something. When Bloom was beside her, she pointed to the town's water tank on Capulin Hill. A dancing trout pickup and a Forest Service truck were parked under the tank, cigarette smoke drifting out the driver's window of the Dude Ranch vehicle. That's Horse Thief Shorty up there, and both Carla Bete and the new guy Floyd, what's his name? They've got a radio, telescopes, binoculars, everything. They're just sitting up there waiting for Jose to show himself in case he doubles back into town. And then they're going to radio the Chotas, and the Chotas are going to come in here and kill him. If I'm with him, nobody will dare try anything, Bloom said. You think so, Charlie? Maybe I better tell you where it's at with you in their eyes. A man from the capital not too long ago, an undercover police agent, said it was your fault that Jose was irrigating his father's bean field. He said it was a plot, and he told these citizens you were a radical. Bloom sagged back into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. An undercover cop? How come he hadn't heard? I don't know what they know and what's real and what isn't, Nancy said. But that's what this undercover man said, and he's the one who went into the mountains with a posse today. So it's not just Jose, Charlie. It's not just him at all. Nancy settled nearby with coffee, sipping quietly from the cup, her alert eyes fixed on the tube. So, we're waiting, Nancy said without taking her eyes off the program. We're waiting for them to make their moves and for them to finish making their moves and for them to go away. And if we have to wait a year for them to leave, we'll wait a year. She seemed astonishingly brave and strong. Bloom stood up. Well, I'm going home, he said. If you change your mind about Joe going in with me, give me a call. Bloom stood quietly in the warm summer sunshine, absorbed by the two trucks parked beneath the water tank. A man got out of one truck, circled behind it, and took a leak. Bloom realized someone was up there right now with his glasses trained on the valley, on the town, a radio by his side, searching for Joe Mondragon. Suddenly, Bloom was enraged. Raising one arm, he carefully formed an exaggerated, obscene gesture, aiming it emphatically at the pickups. Fuck you, Bloom whispered, dropping his arm. At about noon that day, a backhoe driven by Jerry Grindstaff emerged from the Dancing Trout's white gravel drive, turned right, and descended the bumpy road past thick pastures in which Morgan horses grazed, continued on through the heart of town and across the highway. Jerry G. braked at Joe Mondragon's bean field and lit a cigarette. He had orders from the boss. Lad Devine had decided to kill the heart of the controversy, namely Joe's tiny bean field. Jerry G. hopped off the machine to open up the barbed wire gate into Joe's bean field. But when he swung the gate open and turned around, a little old bespectacled man was standing beside the backhoe's rear wheel, aiming the biggest goddamn shooting iron Jerry G. had ever seen directly at his heart. Okay, go home, Amarante Cordova said. I'll make a hole big enough for an owl to nest in your chest. On the double, Jerry G. hightailed it for the highway. Amarante grinned, giggled, and trembling from the effort, he somehow managed to haul his ancient bone up into the driver's seat of the powerful yellow machine. Bouncing, rocking, tipping, Amarante drove the mammoth mechanical bronco across the wide and lovely mesa. The old man's chin hit against the wheel, the blow almost knocking him out. Yet he was determined to do this thing. His 93-year-old pride would not allow him to fail. His final 3 teeth were jarred loose. But he whooped aloud, croaking hoarsely, gluttonously, joyful sounds, riding that bright yellow Lad Devine backhoe westward, ever westward, towards the gorge. And he could see it now. With the gorge in sight, he stepped on the gas, and all hell broke loose. What a way, he thought. What a glorious way to go. The split in the earth widened, became immense. The ground sloped more, became smoother. The backhoe glanced off a boulder and he was thrown from the yellow machine, crashing atop a sagebrush and bouncing from it into a small cholla cactus. And with that, abruptly, the violence and the noise and the jerking and the bolting and the chugging were gone. And Amarante saw the backhoe nose out into space and then keel over, diving from sight. Summoning his last reserve of strength, the old man limped to the edge in order to watch it fall. Turning several somersaults and bursting into flame, the backhoe sailed down, trailing a brilliant fantail of sparks. Then, with a stupendous sizzle, it splashed into the Rio Grande, sinking instantly, leaving a fat, greasy smoke ball hovering like a concerned mother over the bubbling spot where it had disappeared. When Herbie Goldfarb had opened his door late the night before and found himself staring into the broadly grinning mouth and clenched Viva Zapata teeth of Joe Mondragon, he figured his life was about to come to an abrupt and no doubt gory end. But Joe just kept grinning, chuckled, "Hello, Goldie, how they hanging?" and stepped over the threshold to wait out the storm. Now, next day after tipping up the last beer in Herbie's stack of six-packs, Joe said, "Herbert, we need some more cerveza." "If I go for beer," Herbie protested, they'll get suspicious." And he could picture it already, his miserable hovel surrounded by state cops and by the National Guard, a bullhorn blaring, "We know you're in there, Joe!" Sirens wailing and red lights blipping, TV cameras whirring, and then Joe yelling back, "Come and get me, you pendejo brain yellow-bellied motherfucking cabrones!" as he ripped off a shot through the high little window while Herbie cowered in a corner by the stove. And then all of them out there would open at once with their high-powered rifles and machine gun bullets chewing the adobe walls to pieces, opening holes big enough to drive tanks through. "Suspicious?" Joe asked. "Who? Tranquis Yantete? Shit, man, if he knew for sure I was here with you, he'd give you the beer for free. And anyway, who's gonna look for me here? I mean, who even knows you exist?" "Thanks," Herbie thought grimly. "I needed that." Joe blinked away some beer fuzz that was making blue streaks across his eyeballs and remarked, "You don't even know what this is all about, do you?" Talking through the walnut-sized knot in his throat, Herbie croaked, "You shot a person. You killed a man." Oh, for Christ's sakes, that old fuck, he didn't even have anything to do with it. "Listen, let me tell you about the way things have been around here. Let me tell you about my father." Herbie just sat there letting Joe talk. And Joe told Herbie the long story of his father, who had been driven from the west side by the termination of the water rights, and how he was forced to become a migrant worker and died in the hot sun in the middle of a potato field in Colorado. "So that's how come," Joe said. "That's how come what?" Herbie had the audacity or the stupidity to ask. "That's how come all this," Joe said. "Oh," Herbie said. Joe certainly had a way of making everything as clear as mud. As clear as Milagro mud, he added in afterthought, and despite the tense situation, Herbie almost caught himself in a ridiculous smile. At 1 p.m., the posse reached the lowest Little Baldy Bear Lake. Most of the posse's men collapsed close to the tree line, on mossy ground among large rocks. Agent Kirill Montana propped his rifle against a tree, eased off his pack, and sat on a small boulder. Bernabe Montoya slipped off his gun belt and lowered himself onto a rotting log near the agent. He bit into a burrito, cold beans and green chili wrapped in a tortilla, and chewed thoughtfully for a while, gazing up at the first gray, threatening afternoon clouds. "If he was there, one of these men would have spotted him," Bernabe said. "What's on the other side of that ridge between Little Baldy Bear Mountain and Lead Tear Peak?" the agent asked. "There's a trail that goes down to Truchas Lake. If you follow it far enough, it leads to Dixonburg," the agent said. "I'm going to climb Little Baldy Bear Peak and then hike north along the ridge there. The rest of you can go home. Take the trail straight down the canyon. The weather is probably going to get ugly. I think Bernie here is right. I think we'll just wait for Joe Mondragon to come home. He can't last more than a couple days at most up here." Bernabe stood, buckling on his gun belt. "Sooner or later, somebody will reach Jose and tell him it's not as bad as he thinks. That will bring him in, and this will all be resolved to everybody's satisfaction." The sheriff rounded up his men, and suddenly they disappeared in the trees, and the agent was alone. He climbed 3/4 of the way up the ridge and stopped. The wind was blowing steadily, and clouds obscured the sun. Setting down his gun, the agent braced himself against the rock and began to scan the area with his binoculars. It was while panning his field glasses on the upper reaches of Deer Hair Canyon that he came upon a man standing about 200 yards directly opposite. And this man was aiming a rifle at Kirill Montana. At almost the exact instant the glasses touched on the man and the agent registered his enormous bulk, he also registered a slight white puff of smoke from the gun. and at that he automatically collapsed himself sideways as a small piece of the rock he had been leaning against exploded. Hitting the rocky earth hard, he kept rolling 3 or 4 times, and he heard the report of the shot that could have killed him. And then, after he stopped, tucked up tight behind a small boulder, he heard 2 more gunshots from bullets, and it must have been fired at him while he was rolling. Crouched behind and hugging tightly to his rock, Carol Montana waited for a moment without budging. His rifle was 10 yards above him, useless. The field glasses were on the ground 3 yards to the right of the gun, and he dared not move. Suddenly, a piece of the rock against which his gun was leaning exploded inches from the rifle, and then the rifle went haywire, bouncing sideways off the rock. A useless weapon when it hit the ground. The scope also splintered. Another gunshot echoed across the valley. "You son of a bitch," he whispered. "You miserable goddamn son of a bitch." And now he was in more trouble than he had ever been in before. He came to the absolute and irrefutable realization that he had been caught in a trap. He needed his field glasses. He rubbed his eyes and refocused on the binoculars. Counting to 5, then he lunged into the open and ran zigzagging, slightly hunched over, avoiding all obstacles, grabbing the glasses as he passed by and swinging around the large rock. The boulder was plenty wide, but his silhouette was smooth. There was no place really where he could poke his head out and not be conspicuous. In the end, stretched out on his belly, inching ahead a little with his elbows, he peered out. Carol Montana brought his glasses swiftly down from the lake into the wide meadow directly below and onto a horseman progressing slowly around the eastern shore of the lake beside which the agent had eaten lunch. He thought he recognized the horse, a big dappled gray. The rider could have been any one of 100 citizens from Milagro, small and wiry looking, his face completely shadowed by a straw cowboy hat with the front brim bent down. He wore a faded denim jacket, Levi's, brown cowboy boots, and a gun belt. There was also a rifle in the saddle scabbard. As the agent watched, the small man lifted a hand in greeting. Swinging his glasses across the water and the meadow grass, he saw the man who had been firing at him. The 2 horsemen came together in the meadow. They spoke briefly, and then the bigger man fixed his binoculars on Carol Montana's rock. Taking his time, he raised the rifle, aiming directly at the agent, who was for some reason mesmerized. The rock shattered a foot above his head, splashing pulverized dust and sharp slivers into his face and arm, and only then, howling with pain, did he jerk back sharply, incredulous at his own stupidity. He checked on the 2 horsemen again. The smaller man was heading up the ridge on his horse safely beyond pistol range. The bigger man remained down below, dismounted, kneeling behind a rock with his rifle aimed directly up at Carol Montana. Almost by accident, he glanced up at the ridge in time to see a 3rd man not 100 yards away on foot and also carrying a rifle rise into view. Even before he raised the glasses, he knew it was a boy. The kid obviously had not seen Carol Montana. Carol Montana raised his pistol, aimed upward a foot or so to the right of the silhouette and a little above his head, cocked the hammer with his thumb and pulled the trigger. The kid didn't move, didn't even lift his rifle. So he pulled back the hammer, took careful aim directly on the target, and fired again. This time the kid moved in a strange side shuffle a couple yards to his right, where he stopped and raised his rifle. Then the kid was shooting rapidly, excitedly, popping his shots off fast. During this flurry, the agent crouched flat against a rock with his arms crossed, his own gun held sideways across his face, eyes clenched shut and everything tensed, waiting to get hit. And then he swung his arm to the right because the small horseman had come into view and the agent wildly punched off his last shot. Without even waiting to see if he'd hit the man, though certain he had not, the agent reloaded the gun. When he clicked the chamber back into place, he looked up and saw the kid above him, reloaded, rising, and the rider off to the right dismounting off the far and protected side of his horse, and at that moment it started to hail. It happened so suddenly that at first the agent cringed and doubled over, thinking the hailstones were bullets. But as soon as he understood what was happening, he scrambled to his feet, spun around, and began sprinting towards the trees. Within seconds, the ground was white with the icy stones, and the agent slipped once, pelted by the hail, and falling once more and rolling several times, and then bolting up again and plummeting the last few yards into the trees where the covering pine branches were so thick that suddenly it wasn't hailing anymore. Carol Montana looked at his hands. They were raw and bleeding. His pants were split at the knees, and his kneecaps scraped raw and bloody. The side of one hiking boot was torn open, but he was alive, still mobile, and in the trees, and from here on in it was a whole new ballgame. But he had dropped his gun. He turned around and plunged deeper into the trees, staggering pell-mell down through the forest and the canyons toward his car 4 miles below.
Eliu Archuleta was surprised, shocked, and almost knocked down by the sudden onslaught of hail. When he saw the agent whirl and make a break, he was firing and jamming down the lever and yanking it back up with his finger on the trigger so that the shot automatically got off. Then he started trotting down through the pelting hailstones toward the rock, shouting in Spanish, "How was that? How was that?" to his mother. They met at the rock, both on foot, Ruby leading her horse. "I should have come closer," Eliu said with a shrug. "I missed that son of a bitch by too much every time." "You came close enough," Ruby said. "In fact, for a second I thought you might have hit him." "Even so, you shoot like hell," Ruby said, smiling a little. "He was shooting at me. He didn't know I wasn't trying to kill him." "You both shoot like hell, so you're both alive and God is smiling. But I'm not. I'm unhappy because I think Claudio shot too close and maybe hit him." The hail abated and they both looked down the slope to where Claudio Garcia, kicking hard, was driving his horse up towards them. "I guess we scared him enough," Claudio said. He was tired and a little shaken, maybe because the agent could identify them, or maybe they had hit him. Maybe they should have killed him. Claudio, for one, had very much wanted to kill him, and he was still shaken from how difficult it had been to miss. "I wonder," Eliu said, "if we should have killed him." Ruby cuffed him gently behind the ear. "What are you, a total pendejo? If we had killed that cop, they would have rounded up all the men in town and cut off their heads and hung them from their patrol car's antennas. Come on, you stupid men, let's go home where it's warm." At 2 p.m. on the afternoon of the first day's hunt for Joe Mondragon, the subject of this hunt, accompanied by his wife and brother-in-law, Eloy Quintana, and by Jimmy Ortega, walked into State Police Headquarters at Doña Luz. "I hear somebody's looking for me," Joe said. "Where the hell is everybody?" Sure, listen," said the flustered dispatcher. Bill Kuntz is parked up at Louis' Cafe. Why don't you just drive up there?" "Wonderful." Joe and his entourage left State Police Headquarters and drove back up the highway to Louis' Cafe. Bill Kuntz was sitting at the counter tapping up tostada crumbs with his middle finger and licking them off when Joe and his people walked in. After the state cop had picked up his jaw, he asked, "Ain't you supposed to be up in the mountains?" Impatiently, Joe said, "Look, all I want to know is what am I supposed to do, that's all." "The guy you shot, Pacheco, he's gonna live." "Hey, that asshole came at me with a gun," Joe said. "He was crazy." "Yeah, I know. There's even a couple of witnesses. So let's go back down to headquarters," Kuntz said, adjusting his cap. "Well, what am I going to be charged with?" asked Joe nervously. "I'm not sure." The Quintana truck followed Kuntz's car back to the Doña Luz State Police Headquarters. Once there, Kuntz called Javier Trucho. "We got Joe Mondragon. Now exactly what do you want done?" "You're kidding me, you son of a bitch. Look, hold him there for a while. Kill him if he tries to walk out the door. I want to go over everything we got in this case and consult a few people." "Anything you say," Kuntz said. "But what'll I tell Mondragon?" "Tell him it'll be aggravated assault or something. Be vague. But don't let the little SOB out of your sight." He hung up and told Joe, "You'll have to stick around for a while we get some things straightened out." "Well, am I under arrest?" "Well, let's just say that right now you're cooperating with us." "If I'm not under arrest, I'm getting out of here." "Well, in that case, you're under arrest." "For what?" Aggravated assault, assault and battery, flight to avoid prosecution, resisting arrest, suspicion of attempted murder, conspiracy, attempted manslaughter, illegal use of irrigation water, discharging a weapon within city limits, and destruction of private property, namely Pacheco's pig. Will that be enough for you, or do you want me to start running down some of the peripheral charges that could go along with the major ones?" Joe snarled, "You can't put any of that on me." Kuntz, who angered almost as quickly as Joe, said, "We can cut you up in 8 seconds and spread you out on the highway for crowbait if we want. So you just shut up and sit down right where you are until we get a couple things straightened out around here." But Nancy stalked to the counter behind which Bill Kuntz was standing, and eyes narrow, and she hissed, "Listen, Chota, you don't talk to my husband like that." "Okay," Kuntz swung around faster on the corner and pointing to her, Eloy Quintana and Jimmy Ortega said, you, and you, out!" Bill Kuntz went to the front door to make sure Nancy, the brother-in-law, and the kid got in the truck. They did. But as they closed the door, another old pickup and then another turned off the highway and parked next to Eloy Quintana's vehicle. 2 more trucks pulled in almost immediately, and several old men got out and came over to talk. In all the truck cabs' gun racks held rifles. Bill Kuntz locked the front door and turned to Joe. "Those your friends out there?" Joe looked up with an exaggerated lack of concern. Yeah, those are my friends out there." Marvin LeBlue in the body shop and Pipe Queen Wrecker and 2 more muddy pickups swerved in and parked, and then a 1957 Oldsmobile, stripped of its fenders and muffler, riding high on its springs, pulled up beside them.
Bill Kuntz told the dispatcher. Get Chamisaville on that machine. Explain the situation. Then he called up Bernabe Montoya in Milagro. I got Joe Mondragon sitting here in the office here reading a magazine. There's about a dozen cars and trucks parked outside full of Milagro citizens. So I figure you and Naranjo better get down here on the double. Bernabe sighed. Sure, Bill. Be right over, and he hung up. Most of the senile brigade now arrived. Kuntz told the dispatcher, see if you can get Bruno on the radio. Bill? Yeah. Look, we got Mondragon sitting here in the office. Maybe we also got a problem. There's about 30 or 40 of his neighbors sitting outside in a bunch of pickup trucks. So how about heading back up here on the double? I'm leaving right now, Bill. Hold the fort. 2 more old and rusty cars pulled up in front of the state police headquarters. Hey, you getting a little nervous? Joe asked. Kuntz didn't answer. He went over to open the door. Charlie Bloom stepped through and Kuntz closed and relocked the door behind him. I'm Mr. Mondragon's lawyer, Bloom said. What are you holding Joe for? We're not really holding him for anything. He more or less just got here. Well, if you haven't fixed a charge for him, Officer Kuntz, I don't think you can hold him. A state police car with a red light flashing bounced frenziedly off the highway and screeched to a stop with its nose practically touching the front door. Leaving the emergency flasher on, Bruno Martinez tumbled out and crashed into the unexpectedly locked door. Another pickup stacked high with green hay bales pulled in, and Bernabe Montoya stepped out. The sheriff nodded to this man, that woman, slapped a teenager on the back and grinned, accepted a cigarette and a light and said something joking to several old-timers on his way to the headquarters, reached for the handle and walked into the locked door. Hey, he muttered loudly, open the door. Bruno Martinez flipped the lock and Bernabe sidled in. The first thing I'd do, he said, is turn off that flashing light unless you want to incite these people to riot. And the second thing I'd do, the sheriff said, going over to flick an ash into the ashtray of the counter, is I'd formally arrest Jose over there for assault or for discharging a weapon illegal or something, and then I'd release him on his own recognizance or in the custody of his lawyer here. Bill Kuntz was going to say something, thought better of it, turned to the dispatcher and muttered, you heard him, make out the forms. Well, I think that about wraps it up, que no? I think Mr. Bloom and Mr. Mondragon ought to leave now. So long, boys. Be careful on that road going back. And Jose? Joe turned around at the door. Yeah? Stick around home, okay? This isn't quite over yet. Sure, Joe grinned obnoxiously. I lived here all my life, didn't I? When they were outside, Kuntz said, I wonder if that wasn't a dumb thing to do. This place was going to explode, Bernabe said. You dumbbells were sitting on a stick of dynamite. Well, suppose they don't leave. They'll leave. They're not crazy. And anyways, they won. The policeman watched as Joe talked with a group of about 10 people. One of Ruby Archuleta's Milagro Land and Water Protection Association petitions was making the rounds, and laughing triumphantly, people were signing it like mad. Kuntz sat down, lighting a cigarette. You really think those people out there mean business? Bernabe said, I know it. Did anybody here call the DA? I talked with him yesterday, Bruno said. They were batting around an open charge of murder. But you know how it is. That Pacheco won't die. The way I'd play it, if somebody asked me, the sheriff said, is I'd find him for destruction of property, making a disturbance, and discharging a weapon within the town limits. The assault you got him on now won't stick, not with those 2 witnesses. Period, Kuntz said glumly. Bernabe stubbed out his cigarette and sucked in a deep breath, which he expelled very slowly, never having felt quite this heady before. Listen, I sat in a room while that Montana fellow outlined the plan he had. Now, I know somebody didn't just make up those plans for fun and games, but I do know they didn't work. I also realize times are changing, and there isn't room for the same type of people up here that there used to be when I was growing up. I know the Zopilote can win in Milagro, but after these couple of days, I know he can't win without a war. And wherever these orders on Jose came from, I know they came with the express intention of avoiding a war. With that, Bernabe suddenly walked outside and almost stunned everybody by signing Ruby Archuleta's petition. But just as he was about to put his name on the wrinkled page, his steady salary as sheriff clobbered him like a stroke, and instead of signing, he read over the petition, nodded a sort of non-committal approval, and with an audible sigh, passed it on. Pretty soon, men, women, and children turned to their dilapidated vehicles, backed up and pulled out, heading north towards home. In a moment, only 2 state cars and Bernabe Montoya's pickup remained in the parking lot. There had never been such rejoicing in the Frontier Bar. The jukebox blared mariachi music. Everybody was very drunk, and because more women than usual were on hand, people tried to dance. Joe and Nancy Mondragon were both so bombed they could hardly stand up, let alone walk. Whereupon Onofre Martinez launched into an epic corrido hailing the afternoon's triumph. In the century of 1900, in the August of this year, a neighbor in our village made a chota's milk run clear. Don Jose of Milagro, last name of Mondragon, led us into a battle, and the battle we have won. When Serafino Pacheco, that man with the awful pig, invaded the blessed Beanfield, Don Jose made him dance a jig. Pacheco was first to fire, 6 shot at Jose's head. With 1 bullet, Mondragon answered, "Que milagro, Pacheco ain't dead." The police came up from the capital. The woods were crawling with coppers, but Don Jose was invisible, even to the noisy choppers. Swift as a deer he outraced them, quiet as a fox he ran. He thumbed his nose as they blundered, he laughed to beat the band. When the time was ripe he entered their headquarters in Doña Luz, and laughed in the face of the chota whose name was William Kuntz. The cops were eager to beat him and shut him up behind bars, and then the angels of Milagro arrived in their jalopy cars. William Kuntz turned pale. He crapped in his pants that day. He groaned and dropped to his knees and loudly started to pray. For his heart was heavily pounding. His heart was pounding hard, and his ugly chota features were colored the color of lard. "Spare me," he cried, "I'm sorry." But Jose only sneered. To see such a frightened copper, so full of pathetic fear. Jose marched out of the station. He greeted us with a clenched fist, and while everybody applauded, his pretty wife he kissed. And so we'll sing the song of Jose, whose Beanfield started a war, that the people of Milagro have won forevermore. The governor himself poured the last 2 of them to arrive, Lad Devine III and Jim Hirshhorn, a double scotch on the rocks and a little brandy respectively, and carried the glasses around the softly lit living room of the governor's mansion to where the newest arrivals sat. Then the governor sat down on a piano stool before a shiny black Steinway and plinked a single thoughtful note. "I take it," he began, getting right down to brass tacks, "things aren't all that hunky-dory up there in Milagro." That's a fairly correct analysis of the situation," Lad Devine said. "I wonder how much of this is going to make the newspapers." "None of it," the governor said. "And Pacheco's going to be okay?" Jim Hirshhorn asked. "So I've been told." "Apparently the people have banded together and they're not all ready to be intimidated," Nelson Bookman said. Roland Kybers cleared his throat prior to changing the subject. What I'm interested in discussing this evening is the future of the Indian Creek Conservancy District and that Indian Creek Dam. "We can't stop that now," Jim Hirshhorn said. "We've already begun to develop the recreation plots up there. Contractors are under contract. We've already invested about, how much would you say, lad, in eastern and midwestern advertising for the Miracle Valley recreation home sites?" "A lot," Devine said. "In the hundreds of thousands." "But it's all a joke," Ursula Bernal said. "You pretend the water is for the people in the valley who don't want it, don't need it, can't use it, but will have to pay for it, while Mr. Hirshhorn and Mr. Devine here make a killing." The governor's small eyes appeared to see nothing, to be gazing stupidly at the rug. But the governor understood some things. He was a Democrat, and he had strength in the North. Milagro itself did not have enough votes to tickle a heifer's balls, but if this thing developed into a scandal or a truly delicate political issue, he and those with him might find themselves in hot water come the next election. He kept returning to this. Suppose somebody or a couple of people or maybe even a cop was shot up there. Suppose those illiterate backward assholes actually tried to launch a kind of disorganized rebellion. It had happened before, and it had cost a territorial governor his head over 100 years ago, and it had cost another governor his political career only 20 years ago. "My feeling is we better back off this for the moment anyways," the governor said, "and I'll speak to Nate about letting it ride indefinitely." "Look, any more delays and I'm going to be up to my ass in lawsuits." Lad Devine had gone pale. "Lad, you jumped to some conclusions," the governor said, "and so did I. From now on, we're just going to have to progress a little more slowly in the North. I didn't jump to any conclusions that your office and Nelson Bookman's office didn't lead me into." "Mr. Devine," the governor said, "you may forget, but I have an investment in this thing, and I'm not the kind of man who cuts off his nose to spite his own face. I fold when I'm not holding a winning hand and wait for better cards. Do I make myself clear?" Stopping, he looked down. His angry voice sagged. "We've done all right for a long time in this state, lad. Now don't try to cross me now. This is not a particularly happy moment in any of our lives. Joe Mondragon squatted on the ditch bank overlooking his bean field. Nancy sat against the trunk of a nearby cottonwood. Joe's eyes and his brain were so bleary he could barely see, let alone think. But he was feeling a lot of things. And among the feelings, Joe could single out a couple for particular consideration, namely, the feeling of being triumphant and important, and the feeling of being scared shitless. Nancy came over, squatting beside him, resting an arm over his shoulder. "Hi-ho, Jose, my love," she whispered drunkenly, tenderly kissing his shoulder. The mesa coyotes were singing, calling to each other or challenging the moon, and the cottonwood leaves were so still they could hear Indian Creek bubbling over smooth stones across the road a ways. They could even hear the jukebox music at the frontier bar in town, the music remote like a fiesta memory from the old days. "When Serafino Pacheco gets back, you know what?" Joe murmured. "I'm afraid to ask." She leaned over just slightly, touching her tongue to his earlobe. "I'm going to give him one of those piglets we got for a present." "Ay, Chihuahua," Nancy laughed. "What do you want to go and start that trouble all over again for?" "So when the pig grows up, I can shoot him again," Joe cackled, and suddenly, sputtering happily, he toppled out of her arms and rolled right down the short slope into his bean plants, laughing to beat the band. And Pacheco, asleep, laboring for his life, dreamed. It was 5 o'clock on a summer evening. Bees simmered. A lush apricot swoon weighted the air. His wife was playing the piano, Chopin, a prelude. Men irrigating in the silver fields paused, leaning on their shovel handles to listen. A deep bell clanged. Animals lazing home. Dust stirred up by the day's traffic on the roads hung softly, a beige mist across the field. Melvin, who died later on in Korea, caressed the slow August landscape, chasing butterflies. The laughter of children half a mile away carried clearly across the field. Then death, decked out in a sombrero, a sarape, and shiny silver spurs, a spicy carnival apparition dancing over the little village, chuckled like a dove, winked in a joking, comradely fashion at Pacheco,